It was the autumn of 1941, and the German Wehrmacht stood at the very gates of Moscow. After months of stunning victories, the armies of Hitler's war machine had swept across the Soviet Union with speed and ferocity, capturing vast territories, destroying Red Army formations, and leaving behind a trail of devastation. Now came Operation Typhoon, the grand offensive designed to deliver the final blow, the capture of Moscow, the beating heart of the Soviet Union, a city whose fall was expected to bring the Soviet state crashing down. The Germans threw everything they had into this gamble: hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and the Luftwaffe overhead. Against them stood a battered but unbroken Soviet defense, armies regrouping and digging in, civilians fortifying their city, and the first hints of the Russian winter creeping into the soil and the air. The road to Moscow became a struggle not just of armies, but of will, of endurance, of a clash between two visions of the world. Mud, snow, frost, and fire turned the fields and forests into a killing ground, while both soldiers and civilians endured hunger, exhaustion, and fear. For the Germans, it was meant to be the decisive victory of the war. For the Soviets, it became a fight for survival itself. The fate of Moscow was the fate of a nation, and what happened between October and December 1941 would echo throughout history. Tonight we will walk through every phase of this colossal struggle: the strategies, the battles, the leaders, the soldiers, and the ordinary people who bore the weight of war. We will uncover why the Germans came so close to victory, why they ultimately failed, and how the resilience of Moscow changed the entire course of the Second World War. But before we begin this journey into one of the most desperate and decisive battles in history, I want to ask you, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it right now, as you join us for the epic story of Operation Typhoon, the battle for Moscow? The summer of 1941 had shattered illusions on both sides of the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's grand gamble to crush the Soviet Union in a single stroke, had surged forward with terrifying speed. Panzer columns ripped through border defenses, encircling entire Soviet armies, while Luftwaffe squadrons reduced airfields to flaming wreckage. German soldiers believed they were witnessing the unraveling of Bolshevik power, convinced victory was only weeks away. By September, Kiev had fallen, Smolensk was behind them, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners trudged westward in endless columns. Yet beneath the triumph, the Wehrmacht was already straining. Its supply lines stretched thin across thousands of kilometers of hostile land. Railroads had to be converted, trucks broke down, and horses dragged wagons of ammunition through seas of dust and mud. The Red Army, beaten but unbroken, melted eastward, regrouping in the shadows of vast forests and rivers. Every village torched, every bridge blown, forced the Germans to spend precious time and resources. Barbarossa had not destroyed the Soviet Union, it had only awakened it. For the men of the Wehrmacht, the opening months of the campaign were a blur of constant advance. Infantry marched along roads clogged with tanks, artillery, and supply columns, often covering 30 kilometers a day under the punishing summer sun. Soldiers wrote home of endless horizons, captured towns, and the strange vastness of Russia. Yet behind those letters lay exhaustion, boots worn to shreds, rations spoiled by heat, and the unnerving silence of an enemy who seemed never to run out of men. German commanders praised the speed of encirclements, but worried that too many Soviet formations slipped away to fight another day. Soviet partisans began to appear, ambushing convoys, cutting telephone lines, and poisoning wells. For every battlefield victory, a new wave of resistance emerged from the forests and villages left behind. The sense of inevitability that had marked the opening weeks began to erode as the days dragged on. Still, the lure of Moscow, so close in imagination, yet still distant on the map, drove the German army onward. The capital Hitler promised would be the prize that ended the campaign. For Soviet soldiers, the summer of 1941 was a nightmare of retreat and sacrifice. Entire divisions were encircled and annihilated, leaving survivors to stagger eastward with nothing but rifles and memories of fallen comrades. Conscripts barely trained were thrown into the fire, often with little more than determination to slow the German advance. Veterans of earlier battles recalled the shock of facing German tanks that seemed unstoppable, their armor shrugging off Soviet shells. Yet amid the chaos, the seeds of resistance took root. Commissars exhorted men to fight for the motherland, while Stalin demanded that every yard of soil be defended at any cost. Propaganda posters depicted Moscow as the heart of Soviet life, a city whose loss would mean death for the revolution itself. Factories dismantled piece by piece were shipped east, away from German bombers, ensuring that the Soviet war machine would continue. Families left behind in burning villages carried stories of defiance, fueling a grim determination among the troops. The Soviets, battered and bleeding, refused to collapse. The nightmare of Barbarossa became the crucible of their awakening. In Berlin, the Nazi leadership exuded confidence, but cracks were forming beneath the rhetoric. Hitler proclaimed that the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse with one hard blow. Goebbels spread propaganda of endless victories, parading captured Soviet flags and columns of prisoners through newsreels. Yet within the corridors of the General Staff, doubts were whispered. Moscow had not fallen in summer as planned, and the Red Army, despite catastrophic losses, continued to field new armies. Reports from the front described dwindling fuel, worn-out tanks, and growing resistance in the rear. German industry, already stretched thin by commitments across Europe and North Africa, struggled to keep up with the colossal demands of the Eastern Front. What had been envisioned as a lightning war was hardening into a campaign of attrition. To the soldiers, the dream of marching triumphantly into Moscow by autumn seemed ever more distant. Still, faith in Hitler's vision kept them moving forward. The next blow, they were told, would break the Soviet spine. For the people of Moscow, Barbarossa brought dread and defiance in equal measure. Trains poured into the city, carrying refugees from the west, their belongings piled high, their stories of German cruelty spreading fear through the capital. Yet the city refused to yield to despair. Men, women, and even children dug trenches on the outskirts, shoveling earth with blistered hands, preparing defenses for battles yet to come. Factories thundered day and night, turning out tanks, rifles, and ammunition in a race against time. The Kremlin itself became a fortress, its spires camouflaged with paint, its leaders determined to remain even as bombs fell nearby. Stalin ordered the evacuation of industries, but not the heart of power. Moscow, he declared, would not be abandoned. At night, blackout curtains plunged the city into darkness, broken only by the drone of Luftwaffe raids overhead. Propaganda loudspeakers urged calm, praising the heroism of the Red Army. Beneath the anxiety lay a deep current of resolve. Moscow was not just a city, it was the soul of the Soviet Union, and its defense would be absolute. As September turned to October, the German timetable grew desperate. Hitler demanded one final push before winter, a blow to seize Moscow and secure the Eastern Front. The generals, weary of attrition, debated the risks, but the orders were clear. Army Group Center was reinforced with fresh divisions, panzers were repaired, and fuel convoys strained to keep up. Soldiers cleaned weapons, sharpened bayonets, and prepared for another great drive eastward. The weather, however, was already turning. The skies darkened with autumn rains, turning roads into oceans of mud, clogging engines and breaking horses. Supply lines faltered as trucks sank axle deep, forcing men to drag guns by hand. The momentum of summer had vanished, replaced by the grinding pace of exhaustion. Yet the orders remained: Moscow must be taken before the snow fell. The Germans believed the city was within their grasp, unaware of the storm that awaited them. On the Soviet side, preparations reached fever pitch. Stalin summoned Zhukov to Moscow, tasking him with orchestrating the defense of the capital. Divisions were pulled from the reserves. Hastily trained recruits joined the ranks, and new lines of fortifications stretched across the landscape. Engineers planted mines, built bunkers, and flooded fields to slow advancing tanks. The defense of Moscow was not only a military necessity, but a matter of survival for the Soviet state. Stalin's speeches galvanized the population, insisting that retreat was no longer an option. Propaganda invoked images of Napoleon's failed invasion, reminding all that the Russian winter had humbled empires before. Behind the front lines, factories in the Urals and Siberia churned out weapons that would soon arm new armies. The Soviet Union was bleeding, but it was not broken. Moscow stood as both target and symbol, a beacon around which the Red Army rallied. Every man and woman understood the battle for the capital would decide the fate of the war. For ordinary soldiers, the coming clash felt both inevitable and terrifying. In German camps, men dreamed of being home by Christmas, yet shivered in damp foxholes as rain soaked their uniforms. Tanks, once the unstoppable vanguard of blitzkrieg, now sat mired in mud, engines coughing, fuel tanks running low. In Soviet trenches, young conscripts clutched rifles with trembling hands, hearing rumors that the Germans were already at the gates. Letters written in pencil, on scraps of paper, carried both fear and determination back to distant families. Soldiers on both sides shared a gnawing sense of exhaustion, yet also of destiny, that something monumental was about to unfold. They could not see the grand strategies drawn on maps, but they felt the weight of history pressing down on them. In Moscow, civilians waited, anxious but resolute, ready to defend their homes, street by street. Across the vast front, the storm clouds of battle gathered. Operation Typhoon, the final German thrust toward Moscow, was about to begin. Operation Barbarossa had promised a swift victory, but instead it had delivered a war of annihilation without end. The Wehrmacht, so confident in summer, now stood at a crossroads, battered yet determined to strike at the Soviet heart. The Red Army, bloodied and scarred, had endured catastrophe, yet refused to collapse. Both sides prepared for a showdown that would test not only armies, but nations. The fate of Moscow was no longer just a military question, it was a symbol of endurance, ideology, and survival. Hitler believed that capturing the Soviet capital would bring Stalin's empire crashing down. Stalin believed that defending it would inspire his people to victory. In the autumn of 1941, as the mud thickened and the nights grew colder, the world held its breath. The largest city yet threatened in the war was about to become a battlefield. The next phase of the Eastern Front would decide the future of Europe. To Adolf Hitler, Moscow was not just a city on a map, it was the beating heart of the Soviet experiment, the center of power that embodied everything he despised. In his mind, Bolshevism was not only a political system, but an ideological enemy whose destruction would cement German supremacy in Europe. Capturing Moscow, therefore, was more than a military goal. It was a symbolic act meant to prove the weakness of communism and the futility of resistance. Hitler believed that once the Soviet capital fell, the regime would collapse like a house of cards, leaving the rest of the vast empire to crumble. He spoke of Moscow with obsession, as if its capture would validate his vision of racial conquest and Lebensraum. To him, the Soviet Union was an unnatural state, held together by fear, and its heart was ripe for the taking. The city's fall would, in his calculation, break the will of the Soviet people. The Reich's armies would march through Red Square as conquerors, rewriting history with their boots. It was nothing less than a vision of destiny, wrapped in ideology and arrogance. The German High Command understood the city's strategic importance as much as its symbolic weight. Moscow was the Soviet Union's largest transportation hub, its railways stretching out like veins across the continent. Control of the capital would sever the arteries of supply that kept the Red Army alive, cutting off communication between north, south, and east. Its factories produced weapons and munitions, feeding the front lines with the means to fight. Its government buildings housed Stalin and the political machine of the Communist Party, whose directives kept millions mobilized. The psychological blow of its loss, German planners argued, would be devastating. No major nation in the modern world had ever survived the capture of its capital during war. To seize Moscow was to seize the Soviet soul. The Germans, confident from their triumphs in Western Europe, expected history to repeat itself here. If Paris had fallen in weeks, then surely Moscow would do the same. The logic of blitzkrieg suggested nothing less. Hitler infused his generals with this belief, though many harbored doubts beneath their obedience. Men like Holder and Bock recognized the immense challenges of pushing deeper into Soviet territory, especially as autumn rains approached. Yet the Führer's vision drowned hesitation in waves of ideology and charisma. He insisted that the Soviet Union was already collapsing, its armies shattered and its people demoralized. He argued that hesitation was more dangerous than risk, that victory lay in pushing harder before winter set in. German propaganda amplified this vision, depicting Moscow as a rotten metropolis, decadent and fragile, awaiting liberation by Aryan arms. The German soldier at the front, reading newspapers or listening to radio broadcasts, absorbed this certainty. They were told they were marching toward a final victory, one that would end the war in the East by Christmas. The shadow of Napoleon, whose armies had perished in the snows of Russia, was brushed aside with arrogance. This time, Hitler assured them, history would not repeat itself. For the soldiers trudging eastward, Moscow was both dream and torment. They imagined marching in triumph past the Kremlin, parading under the onion domes and towers that had haunted European imagination for centuries. But they also felt the weight of exhaustion, the mud, and the endless horizon that seemed to stretch without end. Moscow was painted in their minds as a prize that justified every hardship, the mud-slick boots, the frostbite already creeping in, the letters from home growing more anxious by the day. Rumors spread through the ranks that Stalin had already fled, that Moscow was ready to collapse, that the people would greet them as liberators. The reality, however, was more elusive. The closer they drew to the capital, the more resistance stiffened, the more casualties mounted, and the more the dream seemed distant. Yet the myth of Moscow, as Hitler had cultivated it, kept them marching. They believed they were racing toward history's climax, unaware of the trap being laid. Within the city itself, the Germans imagined fear and collapse, but the reality was far more complex. Moscow braced itself for the coming storm, and its citizens understood what the Germans planned. Propaganda posters warned of the invaders' cruelty, while loudspeakers proclaimed the city's resilience. Civilians whispered of Hitler's vision to erase Moscow from the map, to turn it into a wasteland unfit for life. The fear was real, but so too was the defiance it provoked. Volunteers dug anti-tank trenches by the thousands, women and children worked in factories round the clock, and soldiers swore oaths to hold the capital at all costs. The idea that their city was targeted not just for conquest but for destruction lit a fire of determination. To the people of Moscow, Hitler's obsession with their city transformed it into something larger than stone and steel. It became a symbol of survival, an anchor in the storm of war. The German vision only deepened Soviet resolve. The symbolism of Moscow extended far beyond the battlefield, reverberating in capitals across the world, to London and Washington. The city's survival was proof that the Soviet Union could withstand the Nazi onslaught. If Moscow fell, doubts would spread about Stalin's regime and the possibility of an Allied victory in Europe. Hitler's rhetoric framed the battle as a clash of civilizations, a war between German order and Soviet chaos. Newspapers in Berlin promised triumph, while Soviet broadcasts declared the city impregnable. This clash of propaganda elevated Moscow into a global symbol, watched by nations waiting to see which ideology would prevail. Diplomats, journalists, and leaders across the globe held their breath, knowing the city's fate could shift the course of the entire war. For Hitler, this only deepened his obsession, turning Moscow into the linchpin of his war of annihilation. The battle for the capital was no longer about maps and railroads, it was about world history. The obsession with Moscow revealed the dangerous gap between ideology and reality. Hitler saw the city as the ultimate prize, the key to breaking the Soviet Union, but his generals wrestled with the brutal arithmetic of logistics. Supplies were dwindling, fuel was scarce, and winter loomed like an executioner's shadow. Still, Hitler dismissed such concerns as weakness. He envisioned Moscow not just as a strategic hub, but as the crown jewel of his conquest, proof of his genius and destiny. To retreat or delay was unthinkable. The German propaganda machine mirrored this fanaticism, portraying the march on Moscow as a holy crusade. Soldiers in the field clung to this vision, believing their sacrifices would soon culminate in glory. Yet behind the optimism lay a creeping fear, unspoken but felt in every frozen camp and muddy road. The dream of Moscow was powerful, but dreams could not shield men from the cold. As autumn darkened into early winter, the vision of Moscow grew ever more urgent, almost frantic. Hitler pushed his armies forward, convinced that each day wasted brought him closer to failure. He demanded speed, ruthlessness, and total commitment. To the soldiers slogging through the mud, the capital seemed to shimmer like a mirage, always just beyond reach, always promised as the final step to victory. The myth of Moscow held them together, masking the strain of endless marches, dwindling supplies, and unyielding resistance. For the Germans, the city represented an ending, a closure to a campaign that had already consumed hundreds of thousands of lives. For the Soviets, it was a beginning, the point where their struggle would transform from survival into triumph. In the end, Hitler's vision of Moscow was both his strength and his undoing. By turning the city into a symbol of destiny, he ensured the battle would be fought with ferocity beyond imagination. Moscow in Hitler's eyes was never merely a target of war. It was the key to his empire, the proof of his ideology, the prize that would silence all critics. He dreamed of its fall as the moment that would define his reign, the conquest that would echo through the centuries. But obsession blinded him to the realities of terrain, weather, and the resilience of his enemy. The soldiers who marched toward Moscow bore this vision in their minds, sustained by promises that victory was near. Yet the capital was not merely a city. It was a fortress, a symbol, and a people's heart. Hitler's dream of seizing Moscow was not just about conquering a place, it was about rewriting history. And in that dream lay the seeds of disaster, for the city would not fall easily, and the obsession with it would cost the Reich dearly. The vision of Moscow was dazzling, but it was also fatal. Moscow in 1941 was not just the Soviet capital, it was the living heart of a vast and embattled empire. Its boulevards and factories throbbed with the pulse of wartime urgency. Every street and workshop turned into a machine for survival. The Kremlin's spires overlooked a city transformed by desperation, its citizens carrying the weight of both fear and defiance. Stalin knew that if Moscow fell, the psychological shock could reverberate across the Soviet Union like a death knell. The city was not only the administrative hub, but also the symbolic core of Soviet power, a beacon that anchored the morale of millions. Its capture would strike deeper than any battlefield defeat, undermining faith in the system itself. Stalin grasped this truth with cold clarity, shaping his every decision in the months leading to the German advance. Moscow was not negotiable, not a bargaining chip, but the red line of survival. In Stalin's mind, the capital was the hinge upon which the fate of communism, and perhaps the world, would turn. The industries of Moscow embodied this dual role of survival and symbolism. In sprawling factories, men and women labored under relentless schedules, producing rifles, artillery shells, and armored vehicles day and night. Even as bombs fell from the skies, workshops roared and workers pressed on, driven by both necessity and fear of failure. Machinery was dismantled and evacuated eastward, but enough remained to sustain the fight at the front. The air was thick with smoke, steam, and the smell of grease, each assembly line a front line of its own. In these factories, slogans were painted on walls, reminding workers that every bullet, every tank, was a blow against fascism. Children delivered parts, elderly women worked shifts that seemed endless, and managers cracked down with ruthless discipline. Moscow's economy was no longer a civilian one. It had become a war machine, one that fused industry with ideology. The factories of Moscow were not just making weapons, they were forging hope in the darkest of times. For the Soviet people, Moscow was more than a city of stone and steel. It was a sanctuary of identity. The Kremlin, Red Square, and Lenin's mausoleum loomed as monuments to a new order, symbols of continuity amid the storm. Stalin understood this and made himself inseparable from the capital's image, his portraits hanging on buildings, his words echoing through radio broadcasts. The city was cast as both fortress and shrine, the ultimate prize for invaders and the ultimate rallying point for defenders. Propaganda amplified this spirit, declaring Moscow unbreakable, its people unyielding, its soil sacred. Posters showed workers with hammers beside soldiers with rifles, all guarding the Kremlin. Public speeches compared the defense of Moscow to Russia's ancient struggles, from Napoleon's retreat to medieval clashes with Mongol hordes. Citizens absorbed this narrative with a mix of pride and dread, aware that they were now living at the center of history. To abandon Moscow would not just mean losing a city, it would mean losing the soul of the Soviet state. Defenses around Moscow rose with astonishing speed and scale, built not only by soldiers, but by civilians who became an army of their own. Tens of thousands dug trenches with their bare hands, erected barricades, and rolled barbed wire across frozen fields. In the forests and open ground surrounding the city, vast networks of anti-tank ditches and fortified positions took shape. Soldiers prepared bunkers while schoolchildren filled sandbags, their small hands trembling in the cold. Every able-bodied citizen was called to defend, and the city became a fortress unlike any other. The work was exhausting, often brutal, but it bound the population together in shared sacrifice. Even as air raid sirens wailed and bombs rumbled in the distance, the people dug deeper and built higher. The defenses were not perfect, but they symbolized something greater than concrete or earth. They represented defiance, a refusal to yield to the Nazi war machine. The city itself had become a battlefield long before the Germans arrived. Inside the Kremlin, Stalin himself played his role with calculated drama. He refused to leave the capital, even when his advisors urged evacuation, insisting that his presence was essential to maintain order. On November 7th, 1941, with German forces at the city's edge, Stalin reviewed a military parade in Red Square. Tanks rolled past Lenin's mausoleum before driving directly to the front lines, a performance designed to inspire the people and terrify the enemy. Stalin's speech that day declared that Moscow would never fall, evoking both history and ideology to steady his nation's resolve. His defiance was not only symbolic, but deeply psychological, convincing his people that their leader shared their fate. For many, this act transformed Stalin from a distant figure into a commander at the heart of their struggle. The Kremlin became more than a seat of government. It became a citadel of resistance. The fate of Moscow and the fate of Stalin were now bound together inextricably. Daily life in the city teetered between fear and resilience. Air raids brought destruction, sirens forcing families underground. Yet each morning workers and soldiers returned to their posts. Food was scarce, ration lines stretched endlessly, and hunger gnawed at the city's spirit. Yet theaters performed, schools operated, and the radio broadcast patriotic songs to fill the silence of despair. Women and children took up roles left behind by men at the front, while elders carried burdens they had thought long behind them. Winter's cold was merciless, but it only deepened the sense of collective endurance. Families huddled together in apartments with shattered windows, listening for distant artillery. Rumors spread of spies, saboteurs and traitors, intensifying the climate of fear. Yet the resilience of ordinary people gave Moscow a strength that no German plan could measure. Each day survived was another victory, another small act of defiance against the approaching storm. For Soviet soldiers defending the approaches to the city, Moscow was more than an objective. It was home. Units stationed along the Mozhask line, or entrenched in snow-covered forests, fought with the knowledge that their families lay just beyond the horizon. To retreat meant more than yielding ground. It meant delivering their loved ones to the invader. Soldiers wrote letters from frozen foxholes, speaking of the city's lights, its avenues, its life that seemed distant yet close enough to touch. Many carried memories of parades, holidays, and school days in the capital, now transfigured into reasons to fight harder. The defense of Moscow was not abstract. It was personal, immediate, and seared into every heart. Orders from the Stavka blended with these emotions, binding strategy with sentiment. In the frozen wastes west of the city, soldiers dug in, willing to sacrifice everything. To them, Moscow was the last line, the place where the war's outcome would be decided. As the shadow of Operation Typhoon loomed, Moscow stood transformed into both fortress and symbol. It was the seat of government, the hub of industry, the cultural core of a nation, and the last barrier against Nazi conquest. Stalin's Moscow was not merely a city under siege, it was the embodiment of defiance, an anvil upon which the Red Army would test the might of the Wehrmacht. Its defenses stretched beyond earthworks and artillery, rooted instead in the spirit of its people. Every trench dug, every tank assembled, every parade held in the shadow of the Kremlin was a declaration that the city would not fall quietly. To the Germans, Moscow was the key to victory. To the Soviets, it was life itself. The battle for Moscow would be fought not only with tanks and rifles, but with willpower, identity, and belief. And in that contest, the city revealed itself as something far greater than geography. It was the soul of a nation, and it would not be surrendered. The autumn of 1941 found Army Group Center standing as the mightiest formation the Wehrmacht had ever assembled on the Eastern Front. It was a juggernaut of steel and men, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, and designed for one purpose: to crush Moscow in a single decisive blow. Around 1.9 million German troops were concentrated for the offensive, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks, thousands of artillery pieces, and hundreds of aircraft. Panzer groups under Hermann Hoth and Heinz Guderian spearheaded the assault, their armored fists expected to smash through Soviet lines and encircle the capital. Behind them stretched divisions of infantry, tasked with mopping up resistance and holding the ground conquered at such speed. The logistics effort was immense, with supply depots overflowing with ammunition, fuel, and winter gear, though much of it would never reach the front in time. The men were weary from months of campaigning, yet their commanders promised them one final push that would deliver victory. For many, Moscow was not just an objective, but the war's promised end. The mood was one of expectation, confidence, and the deadly arrogance born of past success. The structure of Army Group Center reflected Germany's faith in blitzkrieg, where tanks and mechanized divisions led the way. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army, with over 200,000 men, was positioned on the southern wing, prepared to sweep north toward Moscow. Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army, striking from the north, would meet Guderian's thrust in a great encirclement, while infantry armies filled the gap. Supporting them were divisions hardened from battles at Minsk, Smolensk, and Vyazma, men who believed they had already proven their invincibility. Each division carried with it not only equipment, but also hard-earned experience, though losses had thinned their ranks. The SS divisions attached to the advance brought both elite combat capability and a reputation for ruthless brutality. Engineers prepared bridges across rivers, artillery was brought forward to pound Soviet defenses, and Luftwaffe bombers stood ready to blast corridors for the panzers. It was a vast machine of conquest, assembled with precision and aimed like an arrow at the Soviet capital. But beneath the surface of strength, cracks had already begun to show. The Wehrmacht's logistical backbone strained under the vast distances of the Russian plains. Roads were poor, railways had to be converted to German gauge, and fuel stocks were dangerously short for an operation of such scale. Trucks wore out on rutted tracks, horse-drawn wagons filled the gaps, and supply convoys stretched endlessly along dusty roads. Ammunition, spare parts, and winter clothing piled up in depots far to the rear, struggling to keep pace with the forward units. Soldiers at the front often joked bitterly that they could fight anywhere their boots would carry them, but tanks needed a lifeline of fuel that was too easily severed. The autumn rains, the Rasputitsa, turned roads into quagmires, swallowing vehicles whole and reducing progress to a crawl. Mechanics worked in freezing mud to keep tanks moving, while drivers cursed the endless struggle to drag supplies forward. The logistical difficulties were not glamorous, but they were decisive, sapping momentum from the offensive before it even began. Behind every spearhead, there was always the question, would the fuel and shells arrive in time? For the German soldier in the ranks, the approach to Moscow carried both pride and exhaustion. Infantrymen marched through fields littered with the wrecks of previous battles, their boots worn thin and their uniforms stained with months of grime. Letters from home spoke of a quick victory, a Christmas spent back in Germany, and the belief that Moscow would be the final triumph. Yet hunger gnawed at the men. Rations were short, and frostbite had already begun to claim fingers and toes in the chill nights. They built fires from the ruins of villages, their warmth mingling with the smell of smoke and decay. Soldiers recalled the burning of Smolensk, the endless columns of prisoners taken, and believed the Russians were broken. Still, every step closer to Moscow revealed the grim determination of Soviet resistance, partisans striking at their supply lines, and Red Army troops fighting to the last. The men's confidence was tempered by fatigue, a sense that victory lay close but demanded a final sacrifice. The city ahead was both prize and torment, glittering on the horizon like a mirage. At the command level, the mood was one of urgency, mixed with an undercurrent of doubt. Field Marshal von Bock was under immense pressure from Hitler, who demanded rapid victory before winter set in. Guderian, brilliant yet headstrong, pushed his tanks forward with characteristic boldness, but clashed with higher command over objectives. Many generals privately feared the overextension of their forces, warning that supply lines were stretched to breaking. Yet no one dared openly challenge Hitler's conviction that Moscow was the war's decisive target. The Führer saw the Soviet capital as a symbol that, once toppled, would collapse the enemy state. Commanders weighed maps late into the night, drawing arrows across the broad Russian plains, each line representing thousands of lives. The confidence of blitzkrieg still guided their strategy, but experience had begun to whisper of limits. For all their brilliance, the generals were caught in a machine they could not fully control. The Luftwaffe prepared to dominate the skies above Moscow, but its strength was not what it had been in 1940. Pilots were veterans of countless battles flying Mi-109 fighters and Ju-87 Stukas, but attrition had taken its toll. Airfields were stretched forward, vulnerable to Soviet counterstrikes, and fuel shortages limited sorties. Yet the Luftwaffe promised to deliver crushing blows to Soviet positions, clearing the path for the ground forces. Bombers were tasked with hitting railway hubs, fuel depots, and concentrations of troops, choking the Soviet defense before it could form. The men on the ground relied on the Air Force to blind the Red Army, to prevent reinforcements from reaching the capital. But the Soviet Air Force, though battered, was far from destroyed, and every mission carried risks. Pilots faced not only enemy fire, but the biting cold, engines icing at high altitude, frost biting their fingers on control sticks. The air war was a struggle of endurance, no less vital than the armored clashes below. Propaganda reinforced the belief that Moscow's fall was inevitable, feeding soldiers and civilians alike with visions of swift triumph. Posters, speeches, and broadcasts celebrated the final blow against Bolshevism, urging the troops to push forward. Soldiers carried with them not only weapons but also a sense of destiny, told that they were about to reshape history. German newspapers spoke of Moscow as another Paris, a city soon to be paraded through and claimed as spoils. Yet beneath this confidence lay the unspoken reality of mounting losses and the grinding nature of the campaign. Soldiers saw comrades buried in shallow graves, the endless procession of the wounded trudging to the rear. For many, propaganda became a fragile mask, one that barely concealed the fear that the Russians would not break. The closer they came to Moscow, the fiercer the resistance grew, undermining the myth of invincibility. Victory was promised, but doubt shadowed every promise. As September gave way to October, Army Group Center loomed like a storm front at the gates of Moscow. Its divisions stretched across hundreds of miles, poised to launch Operation Typhoon, the great offensive that was meant to end the war. The scale was breathtaking, a colossus of men, machines, and ambition converging on a single city. From generals in command tents to soldiers shivering in the mud, all eyes fixed eastward. They believed that the fate of the Reich rested on this gamble, that Moscow's capture would secure their place in history. Yet behind the might of the Wehrmacht lurked fragility, stretched supply lines, exhausted troops, and the gathering strength of the Soviet defense. The German war machine was still formidable, but its momentum was no longer unstoppable. At the edge of Moscow's horizon, the clash of two titans was about to begin. For the Wehrmacht at the gates, triumph seemed within reach, but the cost and the outcome remained uncertain. In the shadow of the looming German offensive, the Soviet High Command, known as the Stavka, assembled to prepare for what they believed would be the greatest battle of the war. At its head stood Joseph Stalin, grim and unyielding, who understood that Moscow was not only the political heart of the Soviet Union, but also the symbol of its survival. Stalin surrounded himself with his most trusted generals, men who had already proven their steel in the fires of 1941. Chief among them was Georgy Zhukov, a commander whose blend of ruthlessness and clarity of thought made him indispensable. Alongside him, Alexander Vasilevsky, the Stavka's chief of staff, quietly shaped the operational framework of the defense. These men worked under crushing pressure, aware that a single miscalculation could mean catastrophe for the Soviet state. In their underground war rooms, maps of the Moscow region were spread across long tables, each line and arrow representing armies hastily raised or pulled from other fronts. The city's survival depended not on miracles but on planning, improvisation, and sacrifice. The Stavka's immediate concern was the defense in depth around Moscow, a vast system of fortifications that had to be built in weeks, not months. Engineers, soldiers, and civilians alike dug trenches, constructed bunkers, and laid miles of barbed wire across open fields. Women, children, and the elderly joined the effort, wielding shovels and picks in scenes reminiscent of a medieval levy rising to defend the walls of a besieged city. Anti-tank ditches were carved into the earth, deep enough to swallow a German panzer whole. Machine gun nests were hidden among the forests, and artillery batteries were positioned to cover every road leading to Moscow. Zhukov insisted that the Germans must bleed for every step, that their advance would collapse under the weight of attrition. The Red Army, still battered from the summer's defeats, lacked the luxury of mobility, so fortification became its shield. As the Germans gathered their strength, the Soviets built a fortress out of soil, timber, and determination. Reserves became the Stavka's most precious weapon, and Stalin demanded that entire armies be moved into the Moscow sector. Divisions from Siberia, hardened by years of training in the frozen east, were ordered westward by rail. These men brought with them not only fresh manpower, but also winter equipment and experience in cold weather combat. Their arrival was a closely guarded secret, as German intelligence had assumed the Soviets could no longer summon reinforcements of such quality. Trains rumbled through the night, their windows blacked out, carrying soldiers who knew they were being sent to the decisive front. At the same time, newly conscripted recruits, many barely out of adolescence, were rushed into uniform and thrown into hastily organized units. The Stavka balanced seasoned veterans with these raw formations, hoping that courage and numbers could compensate for inexperience. Every rifle, every gun, and every body mattered, for Moscow had to be defended at any cost. Propaganda played its role in preparing the city and the nation for the storm to come. Soviet newspapers declared that Moscow was impregnable, its people unbreakable, and its defenders unstoppable. Posters proclaimed the duty of every citizen to protect the motherland, while radio broadcasts carried stirring speeches that echoed Stalin's iron resolve. Yet beneath this facade, the truth was harsher. Panic and fear ran through the capital as German forces drew closer. Evacuations of government ministries, industrial plants, and civilians began in earnest, clogging the railways that also carried reinforcements to the front. The population was reminded daily that surrender was not an option, that the Soviet Union would live or die in the streets of Moscow. This fusion of fear, defiance, and patriotic fervor gave the city an atmosphere both electric and terrifying. For the Stavka, propaganda was not only a tool of morale but a weapon of war, keeping the people aligned with the grim demands of survival. At the same time, Stalin faced the challenge of maintaining control without suffocating his generals. The dictator had learned bitter lessons from the purges of the 1930s, which had decimated the Red Army's leadership. Now, in the face of annihilation, he gave his commanders more room to act, though his suspicion never vanished. Zhukov in particular commanded a degree of autonomy rare in Stalin's circle, and his ability to think independently proved crucial. He coordinated the positioning of armies, shifting units like chess pieces across a vast board. Orders flowed constantly from Stavka headquarters, not just to fight but to endure, to hold ground until reserves could plug the gaps. Stalin's hand was firm, but he no longer micromanaged every tactical decision, recognizing the scale of the battle demanded trust in capable subordinates. This uneasy balance between dictatorship and delegation became one of the Soviet Union's unlikely strengths in 1941. The weather, too, entered the Stavka's calculations, as autumn gave way to the bitter cold of the Russian winter. Soviet planners understood that time was their ally, and that delaying the German advance would hand them the advantage. Snow and frost would paralyze German logistics, while Soviet troops equipped with fur-lined coats and felt boots could fight in conditions their enemies dreaded. The Stavka ordered defensive lines to exploit rivers, forests, and swamps that would slow tanks and funnel infantry into killing zones. Artillery was placed to fire over ice and snow, and ski troops trained for flanking maneuvers in frozen forests. Civilians were warned to prepare for siege-like conditions, stockpiling food and fuel against the coming winter. Every day that the Germans were delayed was a victory in itself, and the weather was expected to finish what Soviet resistance began. In this way, the elements became part of the Soviet defense, a silent ally waiting to strike. Beneath the planning and propaganda lay the human cost, and the Stavka was not blind to it. Entire divisions would be sacrificed to buy time, thrown against German tanks with little more than rifles and grenades. Soldiers dug their trenches, knowing they might never leave them alive, while civilians labored with the same fatalism. Orders were clear: no retreat, no surrender, no step backward. For the ordinary Red Army soldier, this meant standing against the Wehrmacht with an understanding that survival was uncertain. Commissars enforced discipline ruthlessly, but morale was often sustained more by patriotism and the defense of home than by fear. Families in Moscow wrote farewell letters to sons and fathers at the front, aware they might never return. The strategy of the Stavka was not abstract. It was written in human lives, each one part of the wall erected to shield the capital. By late September, Moscow was no longer merely a city but a fortress girded for war. Its defenses were layered, its reserves arriving steadily, and its leadership resolved to fight to the last. The Stavka had transformed panic into preparation, channeling fear into action, and turning the capital into a bastion of Soviet resilience. Stalin's presence loomed over every decision, but the skill of generals like Zhukov gave the defense real structure. Civilians, soldiers, and commanders alike became part of a collective struggle, bound by the knowledge that defeat would mean the destruction of their country. The Wehrmacht stood at the gates, but the Soviet High Command had forged a shield of men, steel, and willpower to meet them. As Operation Typhoon prepared to unfold, the fate of Moscow hung in the balance. For the Soviets, it was not just about saving a city, it was about saving the very soul of the nation. The autumn morning of September 30th, 1941, broke with the sound of thunder that did not come from the skies, but from the ground itself. Along the length of the front, thousands of German artillery pieces opened fire, their shells screaming into Soviet positions with a force that shattered trenches and broke bodies in an instant. Soldiers of the Red Army crouched low, clutching their rifles as the earth shook beneath them, the bombardment designed not only to kill, but to paralyze morale. Dust and smoke rose in great plumes, blotting out the sun and leaving the battlefield cloaked in a choking haze. As the barrage lifted, the roar of engines replaced it, the familiar rumble of panzer divisions moving forward in synchronized waves. From above, Luftwaffe bombers swept down, their bombs ripping into rail lines, supply depots, and communication posts, severing the fragile links that held Soviet defenses together. The offensive had begun with the precision of a hammer striking an anvil. For German soldiers, this was the long-awaited push toward Moscow, the culmination of months of brutal fighting. For Soviet defenders, it was the opening of a storm they knew might consume them entirely. The German plan was as audacious as it was ruthless, relying on armored spearheads to tear through Soviet lines and encircle entire armies. Hence Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group struck from the south, aiming to drive through Bryansk and roll northward to trap Soviet formations. Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group lunged from the north, targeting the city of Vyazma as a springboard toward Moscow. Together, these armored claws were meant to close around the Soviet western and reserve fronts, cutting them off in massive encirclements. Infantry divisions followed behind, tasked with mopping up resistance and consolidating captured ground. On maps in German headquarters, arrows pointed cleanly toward Moscow, each line drawn with confidence in victory. Yet the battlefield was no map. It was a landscape of mud, forests, and determined defenders who refused to collapse as easily as planners expected. Still, in the opening days, momentum favored the Wehrmacht, whose divisions advanced at speeds that seemed unstoppable. Soviet soldiers caught in the first strikes experienced a nightmare of disorientation and terror. Entire units found themselves outflanked before they even understood the scale of the assault. Command posts went silent as communication lines were severed, leaving frontline commanders blind to the broader picture. Machine gun nests were bypassed by tanks that appeared suddenly from the mist, their steel forms crashing forward through trees and villages. Infantry, cut off and isolated, fought to the last bullet before being overrun or captured. Civilians in nearby towns watched in horror as columns of German armor poured down roads that only days before had been quiet. Some fled into forests, carrying what they could on carts and wagons, while others dug in with soldiers to defend their homes. The Soviet front was not just broken, it was shattered into fragments, each piece left to fend for itself. The Luftwaffe's dominance in the skies compounded the Soviet plight, as bombers struck relentlessly against troop concentrations and retreating columns. Roadways became killing zones, where refugees and soldiers alike were strafed by Messerschmitt fighters. Trains carrying reinforcements were destroyed before they could reach the front, their wreckage left smoldering along ruined tracks. Soviet anti-aircraft guns fired desperately, their shells exploding in dark puffs against the vast blue sky, but the numbers were too few to challenge German air power. The psychological impact was immense, for every movement in daylight seemed to invite destruction from above. Red Army troops huddled in forests to avoid detection, their advance slowed while the Germans pressed forward without pause. The air war became an extension of the armored thrusts, softening resistance and ensuring the Wehrmacht advance remained fluid. For the Soviets, the battle already felt like a struggle against both men and nature itself. Encirclement quickly became the defining feature of Operation Typhoon's opening phase. At Bryansk and Vyazma, entire Soviet armies were caught in vast pockets, their retreat cut off by converging German pincers. Thousands of soldiers were trapped, their options narrowed to surrender, annihilation, or desperate breakout attempts. German units reported capturing tens of thousands of prisoners in a matter of days, their columns stretching for miles as weary Soviet soldiers trudged toward captivity. Propaganda photographers captured these images as proof of Wehrmacht invincibility, showing endless lines of defeated men herded westward. But behind these triumphs lay the grim reality that many Soviet soldiers chose to fight to the death rather than surrender, turning forests and villages into pockets of bitter resistance. For German troops, the victories were tangible but costly, as they faced ambushes and stubborn defenders who delayed their timetable. For the Red Army, these sacrifices bought time, though the price in lives was staggering. Within Moscow, the first reports of the offensive arrived like distant thunder, their implications slow to be grasped by the civilian population. Newspapers trumpeted victories that were exaggerated or outright fabricated, while whispers spread about catastrophic encirclements to the west. Families with sons at the front clung to hope, though the reality was grim. Civilians worked day and night to fortify the capital, shoveling trenches and reinforcing barricades, as the sound of artillery echoed faintly across the horizon. The contrast between official optimism and whispered dread grew sharper each day, shaping the city's atmosphere into one of anxious anticipation. Stalin ordered that panic be stamped out ruthlessly, reminding Muscovites that surrender was never an option. Yet deep inside, many feared the Germans were now unstoppable, their spearheads cutting toward the heart of the Soviet Union with terrifying speed. The opening days of Typhoon made the fall of Moscow seem not only possible but imminent. For the German soldiers advancing through the forests and plains, the offensive felt like vindication of their sacrifices since June. Columns of tanks thundered forward, their crews confident that the war's final chapter was at hand. Villages fell in rapid succession, with Soviet defenders retreating or destroyed in their path. Officers pushed their men relentlessly, aware that speed was essential to closing the trap around Moscow before winter set in. But even amid these successes, problems emerged: fuel shortages, long supply lines, and mechanical breakdowns slowed the advance. Tanks that had survived artillery and minefields were sometimes halted by nothing more than empty fuel drums or clogged roads. Infantry marched until their boots split, their bodies pushed beyond endurance by the rapid pace. The triumph was real, but beneath it ran currents of exhaustion that hinted at dangers still to come. As the first week of Operation Typhoon drew to a close, German spearheads stood deep inside Soviet territory, having made gains that shocked even their own commanders. Maps in Berlin showed the noose tightening around Moscow, a vision of triumph that seemed within reach. Yet beneath the banners of victory, seeds of doubt were already being sown. The Soviet armies had been battered, but they were not broken, and their reserves had yet to be fully committed. Winter loomed on the horizon, its approach inexorable, promising to challenge every German advance. In the forests and fields around Moscow, new defensive lines were forming, built on sacrifice and desperation. The story of Operation Typhoon was only beginning, and the road ahead would prove far bloodier than either side imagined. The German armored thrusts of Operation Typhoon were designed with one purpose: to close massive claws around Soviet armies west of Moscow and crush them in pockets of annihilation. By early October 1941, these claws began to snap shut, first around Vyazma to the north and Bryansk to the south. At Vyazma, 4 entire Soviet armies, hundreds of thousands of men, suddenly found themselves trapped by converging German panzers. The speed of the encirclement was dizzying, leaving little time for orderly retreat or regrouping. Soldiers who only days earlier had been manning defensive lines now realized they were surrounded on all sides. Panic mixed with defiance as commanders tried to improvise breakout attempts. From the German perspective, these encirclements appeared as stunning victories, promising to clear the road to Moscow. Yet from within the pockets, the reality was one of chaos, desperation, and sacrifice. The encirclements of Vyazma and Bryansk would come to symbolize both the scale of German ambition and the staggering cost borne by the Red Army. The Vyazma pocket was a cauldron of suffering, stretching across forests and villages that became killing grounds for trapped Soviet troops. Artillery rained down day and night, as German batteries targeted any movement within the shrinking perimeter. Luftwaffe aircraft circled overhead like vultures, bombing convoys and strafing stragglers who dared to move in daylight. Entire Soviet divisions found themselves cut into fragments, each fighting its own desperate battle for survival. Communications were severed, and commanders often had no knowledge of whether neighboring units still existed. Food and ammunition dwindled rapidly, forcing soldiers to ration bullets and share scraps of bread. Civilians caught inside the pocket fled into woods, hoping to escape the firestorm, but many were swept up in the chaos or pressed into helping dig trenches. From above, the Vyazma battlefield looked like a landscape of smoke and fire, a grim monument to the destructive reach of modern mechanized warfare. At Bryansk, the story was equally grim, though the terrain offered a different kind of struggle. The forests around the city became both refuge and trap, concealing Soviet movements but also restricting their mobility. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group pressed in from the south, cutting off escape routes and tightening the noose. Soviet soldiers fought tenaciously, turning villages into fortresses and ambushing German columns wherever possible. Yet the sheer weight of German firepower gradually overwhelmed them, forcing retreats into smaller and smaller areas. Prisoners began to flood into German camps by the tens of thousands, exhausted and starving after days of fighting without resupply. Columns of Soviet soldiers, their faces gaunt and uniforms ragged, marched westward under German guard, silent testimony to the scale of the disaster. The Bryansk pocket, like Vyazma, showed the brutal effectiveness of German encirclement tactics. It also revealed the terrible vulnerability of Soviet forces still reeling from the blows of Barbarossa. For the German High Command, the encirclements represented a triumph of planning and execution. Reports boasted of hundreds of thousands of enemy troops captured, with figures climbing daily as pockets collapsed. Propaganda broadcasts across Germany hailed the victories as decisive blows that would bring the Soviet Union to its knees. In Berlin, the fall of Moscow was spoken of as inevitable, the road now clear of Soviet armies. Yet beneath the celebration lay practical concerns. Each encirclement consumed time, resources, and manpower that might otherwise have been used to push directly toward Moscow. The very scale of the victory risked slowing the advance, as infantry had to remain behind to guard prisoners and mop up resistance. German generals, though pleased with the results, debated whether such victories would prove decisive or simply delay the harder battles still to come. The tension between triumph and urgency would haunt every step of Operation Typhoon. Inside the pockets, Soviet soldiers clung to survival in conditions that defied imagination. Breakout attempts were launched repeatedly, often at night, with columns of men charging into German lines under cover of darkness. Some managed to slip through gaps, rejoining scattered Soviet forces further east. Many others were cut down by machine gun fire or captured after exhausting their ammunition. Accounts from survivors described scenes of horror, fields littered with burned-out vehicles, comrades dying of hunger or exposure, and endless days of retreat through smoke-filled forests. Political commissars exhorted men to fight on, reminding them that Moscow depended on their resistance. Families of soldiers trapped in the encirclements waited anxiously in the capital, their hope sustained only by rumors of breakouts and heroic last stands. For those within, the pockets were not just battlefields, they were prisons of mud, fire, and despair. Civilians in Vyazma and Bryansk bore their own share of the tragedy. caught between two armies in the midst of annihilation. Villages were burned in artillery barrages, homes reduced to rubble as Soviet defenders fought room by room against German advances. Families fled with what little they could carry, joining the human tide of refugees clogging the roads. Some sought shelter in forests, where hunger and cold claimed as many lives as bullets and bombs. Others were swept into German captivity, forced into labor camps, or used to support the occupying forces. Tales of loss and survival filtered back to Moscow, fueling anger and grief among those still free. For civilians, the encirclements were not military maneuvers, they were personal catastrophes that tore families apart and scarred entire communities. The suffering of ordinary people became an inseparable part of the broader tragedy unfolding around the capital. The encirclements also carried a strategic dimension that went beyond immediate destruction. By eliminating entire Soviet armies, the Germans hoped to weaken the Red Army so severely that it could no longer defend Moscow. The losses in manpower, equipment, and morale were staggering, with hundreds of tanks destroyed and artillery abandoned in the chaos. Yet the Soviet command used these sacrifices to buy precious time, rushing reserves from Siberia and the Urals to replace shattered divisions. The delay created by these desperate defenses allowed Moscow's fortifications to be strengthened and fresh troops to arrive before the Germans reached the city. In this way, the encirclements were both a disaster and a lifeline, bleeding the Red Army but also slowing the enemy just enough. The paradox of Vyazma and Bryansk was that in destruction lay the seeds of Moscow's survival. As October wore on, the encirclements began to collapse, leaving behind a grim tally of dead, captured and scattered survivors. German reports claimed more than 500,000 Soviet prisoners taken, their numbers so vast that camps struggled to contain them. Soviet leaders, though reeling from the catastrophe, clung to the resilience of those who had escaped. The tragedy became a rallying cry, proof of the sacrifices needed to defend the motherland. In German ranks, confidence soared, with soldiers convinced that final victory was only weeks away. But in the broader arc of the campaign, the encirclements marked not the end but the beginning of a grueling struggle for Moscow. The road east was still long, winter loomed ever closer, and the Soviets, though battered, were far from defeated. The encirclements of Vyazma and Bryansk were both triumph and tragedy, setting the stage for the brutal battles that would follow. The fall of Vyazma and Bryansk opened a yawning gateway toward Moscow, and for the first time in the war, the German army could see the capital of the Soviet Union as an attainable prize. Columns of panzers, their engines roaring, surged eastward with confidence, their commanders convinced that the campaign was nearing its decisive moment. German morale was buoyed by staggering victories, and soldiers wrote home with promises that the war would be over by Christmas. Propaganda broadcasts hailed Moscow as the beating heart of Bolshevism, predicting its collapse would shatter Soviet resistance. Yet alongside triumph ran overconfidence, for the Wehrmacht was already stretched thin, its supply lines pulled across hundreds of kilometers of hostile territory. Fuel trucks struggled to keep pace, and ammunition deliveries lagged behind the advancing spearheads. Soldiers noticed the growing difficulty of keeping their weapons supplied, their bellies full, and their vehicles fueled. Still, the lure of Moscow burned in their minds, a vision of final victory just beyond the horizon. For the Red Army, the retreat eastward was devastating, yet not wholly destructive. As shattered divisions regrouped and new reserves poured in from across the vastness of the Soviet Union. The Soviets had lost hundreds of thousands of men in the encirclements, yet Moscow was too vital to abandon, and reinforcements streamed toward the city. Freshly raised units of conscripts, many barely trained, were rushed into defensive lines, often wearing summer uniforms as winter approached. Siberian divisions, hardened by training in brutal climates, began to arrive, though their presence was still a closely guarded secret. Soviet commanders urged their men to dig deeper trenches, fortify villages, and hold the line no matter the cost. For civilians in Moscow, the news of German advances was terrifying, yet propaganda urged calm and resilience. Posters proclaimed, "Not one step back," while newspapers highlighted stories of heroic resistance. The sense of an approaching storm was palpable, with every family wondering if the capital itself might soon be under siege. The Wehrmacht's advance toward Moscow was marked not only by its speed, but by the mounting strain of logistics, a weakness invisible in the flush of victory. The roads leading east were often little more than tracks of mud, rutted by constant traffic and pounded by autumn rains. Vehicles broke down by the hundreds, their crews forced to abandon them by the roadside. Horse-drawn wagons, a reminder of older wars, increasingly carried supplies where trucks could not pass. German soldiers, used to lightning advances, began to feel the weight of exhaustion, their uniforms filthy and boots worn thin from weeks of marching. Small details told of larger problems: rifles without ammunition, tanks idling for lack of fuel, and soldiers foraging for food in abandoned villages. The further the army pushed toward Moscow, the thinner its lines of supply became, and the more vulnerable it was to delay. Still, the promise of the capital outweighed the gnawing doubts. Many believed that if Moscow fell quickly, these hardships would no longer matter. As the Germans pressed on, the geography itself became a formidable opponent. Rivers, once minor obstacles, now slowed the advance as bridges were blown up by retreating Soviets. Forests provided cover for partisan fighters who struck at convoys, derailing trains and ambushing isolated columns. Vast plains offered no shelter from the elements, and October rains turned dirt roads into quagmires. German tanks, once the spearhead of victory, sometimes found themselves bogged down in mud, their crews forced to dig them out by hand. Infantrymen struggled through knee-deep mire, their pace slowed to a crawl as artillery pieces sank into the muck. The Rasputitsa, the infamous Russian season of mud, had arrived with full force, sapping momentum at the very moment speed was essential. Yet German generals, driven by Hitler's insistence on reaching Moscow, urged their men forward despite the worsening conditions. The dream of capturing the Soviet capital demanded sacrifices, even as nature itself conspired against them. Among German soldiers, the march toward Moscow carried a strange mixture of triumph and fatigue. Letters from the front reveal men writing about the grandeur of the campaign, yet also confessing to the exhaustion that gnawed at them daily. Many spoke of the endless horizon, of villages reduced to ashes, and of civilians staring silently as the army thundered past. Others described the eerie sight of Moscow-bound signposts, each one a reminder that the capital lay just within reach. The hope of an early victory sustained them, but beneath the bravado lurked uncertainty. Some officers worried about the resilience of the Soviet defenders, noting that despite catastrophic losses, the Red Army refused to collapse. The further east they advanced, the more resistance stiffened, as if the land itself demanded every kilometer be bought in blood. Still, optimism prevailed at the lower ranks, with soldiers convinced they were part of history's greatest march. The closer they drew to Moscow, the greater the anticipation and the greater the risks. For the Soviets defending the approaches to the capital, the road to Moscow was not just geography but destiny. Every hill, every village became a line of defense to be held with whatever men and weapons were available. Engineers and civilians labored day and night, digging trenches, laying mines, and constructing bunkers around the city. The industrial heart of Moscow continued to churn, factories still producing tanks and rifles, even as the city braced for attack. Soldiers who had retreated from Vyazma and Bryansk carried the scars of defeat, but also the determination not to yield the capital. Commanders drilled into their men the importance of buying time, time for reinforcements, time for winter, time for Moscow itself to become a fortress. Civilians were not spared from the struggle. Women and children were mobilized to build defenses, transforming entire neighborhoods into networks of obstacles. The road to Moscow thus became not only a battlefield for armies, but a test of national will. Propaganda played a decisive role in shaping perceptions on both sides as the Germans advanced toward the Soviet capital. In Germany, newspapers trumpeted the victories at Vyazma and Bryansk as proof that the Red Army was finished. Maps printed in Berlin showed Moscow as the next inevitable conquest, with the swastika soon to fly over the Kremlin. For Soviet citizens, the tone was very different. Radio broadcasts urged calm but also warned of the gravity of the situation, calling on every man and woman to defend the motherland. Stories of sacrifice were spread widely, glorifying units that fought to the last and civilians who refused to surrender. This war of words mirrored the war of armies, each side fighting not only for territory, but for the hearts and minds of its people. Propaganda kept fear at bay, yet it also heightened the stakes, ensuring that the coming clash around Moscow would be seen as nothing less than apocalyptic. As October waned, the road to Moscow remained open, but it was littered with obstacles both human and natural. German divisions continued to close the distance, their artillery rumbling ever closer to the capital. Yet each advance came at a higher cost, with casualties mounting and supply shortages growing more severe. The Red Army, though battered, refused to break, constantly throwing new reserves into the fight. The weather darkened, the days shortened, and the cold crept in with every passing night. German soldiers found themselves lighting fires to keep warm, a stark reminder that winter was approaching with deadly certainty. Soviet forces, familiar with the coming season, prepared to use it as their greatest ally. The road to Moscow thus became more than a campaign of armies. It was a struggle of endurance, of willpower, and of survival against time itself. Victory seemed near for the Germans, but the shadow of winter loomed large, promising to turn triumph into trial. When the German panzers carved their way through the western approaches, Moscow itself braced for a siege unlike anything in living memory. The city's leaders called upon every citizen, young and old, to take part in the defense of their capital. Civil defense committees sprang up in every district, assigning men to dig trenches, women to construct barricades, and even schoolchildren to haul sandbags. Streets that had once echoed with the hum of trams and chatter of workers now became construction sites, filled with the scrape of shovels and the ring of hammers. Factories worked around the clock, producing not only weapons, but also concrete slabs, barbed wire and tank traps to girdle the city in steel and stone. Churches and government buildings were camouflaged with netting, their outlines blurred to confuse enemy bombers. Parks and boulevards were turned into defensive belts, layered with trenches and artillery positions. The Soviet capital was not simply preparing for war, it was transforming itself into a fortress of survival. Ordinary Muscovites responded to the call with a mixture of dread and determination, knowing that their lives might soon be forfeit in the coming storm. Teachers and students alike abandoned classrooms to join work brigades, wielding shovels with the same urgency as soldiers carried rifles. Women carried stones and logs in their aprons, their hands blistered and raw as they piled obstacles across the boulevards. Pensioners too old to fight found meaning in building bunkers or delivering food to the laborers working through the night. In factories, female workers replaced men who had gone to the front, running heavy machinery and producing shells at a relentless pace. The sound of Moscow at night was no longer only the distant rumble of artillery, but the ceaseless rhythm of its people in motion. Even when air raid sirens howled, many refused to abandon their work, continuing by torchlight as bombs fell in the distance. Every act of labor was charged with the knowledge that their sweat might one day blunt the German advance. The defensive belt encircling Moscow became a marvel of both organization and desperation, stretching for miles across forests, rivers, and plains. Engineers designed intricate layers, anti-tank ditches, wide enough to swallow panzers, minefields concealed in fields of grass, and wooden stakes driven into the ground to trip advancing infantry. Civilians labored side by side with Red Army soldiers, often under the supervision of officers who marked out lines and targets for construction. Farmers abandoned their harvests to dig trenches, sometimes working with nothing more than spades and bare hands. The soil of the Russian heartland turned into a defensive weapon, carved and reshaped to slow the mechanized storm rolling toward it. Railway workers laid tracks that could be quickly dismantled, ready to derail German supply trains should they reach the outskirts of the city. Entire villages were ordered to dismantle their homes, the wood repurposed into fortifications. What emerged was not simply a line of defense, but an entire population's refusal to surrender. Propaganda fused the work of Moscow's people with the mythology of resistance, giving each citizen a sense of being part of history's great struggle. Posters declared, "Moscow will stand," while broadcast reminded listeners of Napoleon's doomed march upon the city more than a century earlier. The Kremlin portrayed the capital as the heart of Russia itself, a city whose survival meant the survival of the entire Soviet Union. These messages resonated deeply, stirring memories of old invasions and igniting a defiance that reached across generations. Writers and poets contributed with fiery verses recited over the radio that framed each shovel of earth as an act of patriotism. Songs were composed and sung by workers at the construction sites, blending sweat and culture into a single expression of unity. Even the smallest child could believe that their handful of sand or wood added strength to the barricades of Moscow. The entire city was told it had become one army, its weapons forged not only from steel but from spirit. As Moscow mobilized, its atmosphere became both surreal and grimly resolute. Trams carried passengers with rifles slung across their backs, while bread queues wound past freshly built tank obstacles. At night, the blackout cloaked the city in darkness, with citizens navigating only by the faint glow of torches or the moon above. Markets remained open, but their goods were scarce, and hunger gnawed at many families. Yet despite shortages, there was little sense of despair. Rather, an iron discipline emerged, enforced both by necessity and fear of the enemy. Conversations in kitchens and on street corners often returned to the same theme: how to endure, how to fight, how to survive what was coming. Mothers whispered to children that Moscow would never fall, even as they tucked them into shelters dug beneath apartment blocks. The ordinary rhythms of urban life fused seamlessly with the extraordinary demands of war, producing a city at once ordinary and transformed. For the Red Army soldiers stationed near the capital, the sight of the people mobilizing provided both comfort and pressure. On one hand, it was inspiring to see civilians sacrificing as much as the soldiers themselves, toiling in cold and hunger with no expectation of glory. On the other hand, the presence of so many non-combatants so close to the front lines reminded commanders of what was at stake. Officers knew that if the Germans reached Moscow, the city's millions of inhabitants would be trapped in the crossfire. Soldiers dug side by side with their families, sometimes in silence, sometimes sharing stories of the front. For many, the work was personal. Their wives and children labored on the same barricades they would one day defend with rifles. The line between civilian and soldier blurred, as Moscow prepared not for retreat, but for a last stand. It was a sobering realization that every man, woman, and child was now enlisted in the war for survival. Daily life in the mobilized city became a cycle of endurance. Shaped by the constant pressure of war, dawn brought the start of labor brigades, who marched with picks and shovels to the outskirts of the city. Midday meals were often nothing more than bread crusts or watery soup shared among dozens of hands. Afternoons saw the continuation of work under the gaze of commissars, who urged speed and discipline. Evenings brought weary workers back into the city, where blackout curtains shut out the glow of lamps, and quiet conversations revolved around news from the front. Families listened to the crackling voices on radios that told of German advances, but also proclaimed Soviet resilience. Nights were punctuated by air raid sirens, sending civilians scrambling into basements and dugouts, only to emerge and return to their work the next morning. The rhythm of survival became mechanical, yet beneath it pulsed a determination that seemed unbreakable. By the time the Germans neared the outer approaches to the capital, Moscow had been transformed into a city girded for battle. Defensive rings surrounded it, manned not only by soldiers but by citizens who had built them with their own hands. Every road leading into the city bristled with obstacles, mines, and ambush positions. Factories continued to produce weapons even as artillery thundered in the distance. The population had been hardened, their fear replaced by grim expectation. Moscow was no longer simply a target on Hitler's map. It had become a living fortress, embodying the will of an entire nation to resist annihilation. The mobilization of its people had turned the Soviet capital into both a symbol and a weapon, and in the weeks ahead, that weapon would be tested against the full fury of the German advance. As the German panzers carved deep into Soviet territory in the autumn of 1941, Adolf Hitler and his generals began to believe the Soviet Union was crumbling. Reports from the front suggested massive encirclements and entire Soviet armies destroyed, giving Berlin the illusion that victory was not only possible, but inevitable. Hitler saw Moscow not just as a city, but as the key to the collapse of Bolshevism, a symbol that once captured would shatter Soviet resistance everywhere. In his war councils, the Führer's confidence spilled into boasts, declaring that the Soviets had lost their final reserves. His generals, though cautious, often echoed this optimism, fearful of contradicting him or appearing hesitant before the supreme leader. Newspapers in Germany printed bold headlines predicting the fall of Moscow within weeks. Soldiers at the front absorbed this propaganda, convinced they were on the verge of completing the greatest campaign in modern history. Yet beneath the triumphalism lurked the reality of exhaustion, dwindling supplies, and a stubborn enemy refusing to break. Hitler's overconfidence created a dangerous illusion, masking the gathering storm that lay ahead. For the men of Army Group Center, the atmosphere was one of contradictory emotions. Fatigue mingled with hope, doubt with certainty. Infantrymen slogged through the mud and rain, many without adequate boots or warm clothing, but believed their suffering would soon end in glory. Tank crews, maintaining their battered machines, whispered that the Red Square might soon be beneath their treads. Officers wrote home that the campaign's final act was unfolding, and letters carried the expectation that Christmas would be celebrated in a conquered Moscow. In Berlin, Hitler fed this narrative, telling his ministers that the Soviets were on the verge of collapse. He dismissed warnings from his generals about supply shortages, insisting that determination alone would carry the Wehrmacht to victory. Maps in his headquarters displayed Moscow as the centerpiece of a collapsing Soviet front, its capture painted as a certainty. This belief spread down the chain of command, intoxicating men who otherwise knew the hardships they faced. It was a confidence born not of the battlefield but of wishful thinking and political necessity. Propaganda amplified this atmosphere of inevitability, portraying the Wehrmacht as invincible and the Soviets as broken. German soldiers read leaflets and newspapers that described Soviet troops surrendering en masse and cities falling with little resistance. Radio broadcasts assured listeners at home that the Eastern Front was nearing its conclusion. Hitler himself used grandiose speeches to frame the Moscow offensive as the final chapter in a war already won. Such messages had a profound psychological effect on soldiers, many of whom ignored the evidence of their own eyes: burned-out tanks, endless supply convoys stuck in mud, and the bitter resilience of Soviet rearguards were explained away as temporary setbacks. For civilians back in Germany, this confidence provided comfort during rationing and bombing raids, reinforcing the idea that sacrifices would soon be rewarded. Yet for commanders in the field, propaganda became a double-edged sword, binding them to a vision that was increasingly divorced from reality. Hitler's overconfidence was not only a personal flaw, but an entire system's commitment to believing victory was already within reach. Meanwhile, Soviet resilience was systematically underestimated by the German leadership. Hitler believed that the Soviet regime was fragile, propped up by terror, and that its people would welcome the fall of Moscow as liberation. He failed to grasp the depth of Russian nationalism, the emotional attachment to Moscow, and the willingness of millions to fight and die for their homeland. The German High Command assumed that the Red Army had expended its reserves, not realizing that new divisions were already being raised beyond the Urals. They also ignored the growing industrial power relocated eastward, continuing to churn out tanks and aircraft even as German forces advanced. Soviet commanders, though bloodied, were learning from their defeats, shaping strategies that exploited German weaknesses. Hitler dismissed these realities, clinging to the idea that the Soviet Union was a house of cards. His generals, aware of the difficulties, often softened their warnings, unwilling to challenge the supreme leader directly. The result was a fatal miscalculation, a belief that the Soviet Union was far weaker than it truly was. The worsening weather added another layer of complexity that Hitler refused to acknowledge. As autumn rains turned roads into rivers of mud, supply convoys slowed to a crawl, and tanks became mired in fields once thought passable. Horses pulling artillery collapsed from exhaustion, their bodies left in the muck as grim markers of the struggle. Ammunition arrived late, fuel was scarce, and food rations dwindled, yet the order remained: press forward toward Moscow. Soldiers grumbled that nature itself had become the enemy, but their complaints rarely reached the ears of their leaders. In Berlin, Hitler dismissed reports of the Rasputitsa as excuses, insisting that the Wehrmacht had endured worse hardships before. He refused to delay the offensive, fearing that any pause might sap momentum and embolden the Soviets. For the men in the ranks, this meant pushing forward despite mud-caked boots, broken vehicles, and growing hunger. Overconfidence blinded the German leadership to the fact that conditions were eroding their advantage with every passing day. As the offensive pressed closer to Moscow, overconfidence translated into reckless expectations. Hitler and his inner circle believed the Soviet capital would fall swiftly once the last defensive lines were breached. Plans were drawn up for a grand parade in Red Square, imagining the spectacle of German banners flying over the Kremlin. Some officers even speculated about renaming the city or turning it into an administrative hub for the new Reich. These fantasies circulated while Soviet defenses hardened, with every mile of ground costing more German lives. Frontline soldiers heard rumors of Moscow's imminent fall, but the reality they faced was unending combat, rain-soaked trenches, and stubborn resistance. The disconnect between the vision in Berlin and the bloodshed in Russia grew ever wider, yet the propaganda machine ensured that soldiers believed they were part of an unstoppable wave, even as casualties mounted. Overconfidence was not simply a mindset, it became a strategy, one that ignored reality in favor of ambition. For the Soviet people and soldiers, German overconfidence was a weapon that could be turned against them. Civilians in Moscow heard stories of German arrogance, of officers boasting they would soon dine in the Kremlin. Such tales stiffened resolve, convincing ordinary citizens that their resistance carried meaning. Soviet propaganda emphasized German hubris, portraying it as weakness that would soon lead to their downfall. On the battlefield, Soviet commanders exploited German assumptions, baiting their opponents into costly assaults. Each delay, each bloody encounter eroded German momentum and undermined their dreams of a swift victory. The very confidence that fueled the German advance also blinded it to the resilience and adaptability of its enemy. By dismissing Soviet strength, the Germans ensured they would encounter it at its most ferocious, and in this way, overconfidence sowed the seeds of eventual failure. By late October 1941, Hitler's overconfidence stood in stark contrast to the grim reality unfolding at the front. The German army had advanced astonishing distances, but at a cost that could not be sustained. Soviet reserves continued to appear, the weather worsened, and the supply system groaned under the strain. Yet Hitler refused to waver, insisting that Moscow was still within reach, and that final victory was imminent. His generals obeyed, trapped between their professional knowledge and the political demands of their leader. Soldiers pressed forward, weary but convinced that their suffering would soon yield triumph. The gap between expectation and reality grew wider with each passing day. Hitler's confidence, once a source of momentum, became a liability that blinded him to the approaching crisis. The German drive toward Moscow was not ending in triumph, but in the slow erosion of strength, beneath the weight of hubris and the resilience of an unbroken enemy. The autumn of 1941 brought with it a force of nature that no general could command, and no soldier could overcome. The rain swept across the vast plains of western Russia, turning roads into treacherous quagmires and fields into oceans of muck. The German advance, once swift and ferocious, slowed to a crawl as tanks bogged down axle-deep in sticky clay. Supply trucks, overburdened and under-maintained, sank into ditches and were abandoned by the roadside. Horses, already exhausted from weeks of hauling artillery, collapsed in the mud, their carcasses left to rot as grim reminders of overextension. Soldiers found themselves waist-deep in freezing sludge, dragging equipment that refused to move. Entire divisions that had prided themselves on speed and maneuver now inched forward at the pace of men on foot. Commanders barked orders for persistence, but even the most disciplined units could not fight nature itself. The blitzkrieg had been built on momentum, yet now momentum was dissolving with every drop of rain. The Rasputitsa, the Russian season of mud, had become an ally of the Soviet Union. For German soldiers, the mud was not simply an obstacle, it was a torment that seeped into every aspect of their existence. Boots filled with water and sludge, leaving men to march with squelching feet, blistered and raw. Uniforms stiffened with dirt, heavy with the weight of sodden fabric that clung to weary bodies. Food arrived late, cold, and spoiled, forcing men to eat in misery while shivering under grey skies. Weapons jammed more frequently, their moving parts choked with grit and grime. Attempts to light fires often failed, as wet wood hissed and smouldered rather than burned. Morale, once buoyed by visions of Moscow, began to erode like the very roads they trudged upon. Soldiers cursed the land, their commanders, and the endless skies that poured down misery. Even hardened veterans of the Western campaigns admitted they had never seen conditions so brutal. The mud was not just under their feet, it was crushing the spirit of the army itself. From the perspective of commanders, Rasputitsa transformed strategy into frustration. Maps showed clear paths to Moscow, But the reality on the ground mocked their lines and arrows. Armored divisions designed to strike fast were forced to halt, waiting for fuel convoys that never arrived. Artillery could not be repositioned quickly enough, leaving gaps in bombardments. Every delay stretched supply lines thinner, while the Soviets used the respite to regroup and reinforce. German generals argued among themselves, some demanding a pause until conditions improved, others insisting momentum must be maintained at all costs. Orders from Hitler left no room for hesitation, advance regardless of weather or loss. But the Wehrmacht, once a storm of steel, was reduced to a lumbering beast stuck in mire. Each kilometer gained required Herculean effort and staggering sacrifice. The season of mud had turned the German war machine into a prisoner of the Russian earth. For the Soviets, Rasputitsa was not a burden but a shield gifted by nature itself. Soldiers in the Red Army understood the mud. They had marched through it, lived in it, and adapted to it long before the Germans arrived. Soviet trucks were fewer and cruder, but their drivers knew the terrain and how to make do when the earth swallowed their wheels. Civilians used horse carts, sledges, and even their own shoulders to bring supplies forward. Partisan fighters exploited the conditions, ambushing stranded convoys and vanishing into the misty forests. Moscow's propaganda machine seized on the mud as a symbol of resistance, proclaiming that the very land was rising to defend the motherland. To the average Soviet citizen, the rains felt like divine justice, a punishment sent upon the invaders. Every day the Germans wallowed in mud was another day closer to the arrival of winter, the great equalizer. For Stalin and his generals, Rasputitsa bought the one resource they needed most: time. Civilian life in villages caught between the lines became a tale of hardship and resilience. Farmers watched their fields dissolve into mud, livestock trapped in boggy pastures, and homes sinking under the weight of rainwater. Yet these same villagers often aided Soviet defenders, guiding troops through hidden paths that avoided the worst quagmires. Women and children carried buckets of food, clothing, and ammunition across landscapes the Germans could not navigate. To them the mud was familiar misery, something endured each year when the seasons changed. Unlike the invaders, they accepted it as part of life and worked within its constraints. Stories spread of peasants laughing at the sight of German tanks stuck helplessly, their treads spinning like trapped animals. While the Germans cursed, the locals found grim satisfaction, believing their land itself was taking revenge. Civilians were no less cold, wet, or hungry than the soldiers, but their suffering was laced with defiance. The Rasputitsa became both a hardship and a weapon in their hands. For the Luftwaffe, the rains presented their own unique set of challenges. Airfields turned to swamps, runways unusable, and planes mired in mud up to their fuselages. Takeoffs became perilous, landings worse, and maintenance crews struggled to keep machines operational in constant downpours. Without reliable air support, German ground forces lost one of their critical advantages. The Soviets, by contrast, adapted with makeshift strips carved into higher ground, allowing limited but vital sorties to harass the enemy. Clouds hung low, grounding much of the Luftwaffe's strength and denying the Wehrmacht its aerial shield. The dream of overwhelming firepower from above faded into the reality of grounded wings. German soldiers, accustomed to calling on aircraft for relief, now fought without cover against dug-in Soviet defenses. The mud silenced not only tanks and trucks, but also the roar of engines in the skies. Rasputitsa had crippled the Wehrmacht on land and in the air alike. For Hitler, the season of mud was an inconvenience he refused to fully acknowledge. In his headquarters, he dismissed reports of bogged-down divisions as excuses, insisting that the will of the German soldier would overcome nature itself. He demanded fresh offensives, ignoring the desperate pleas of generals who begged for a pause. His orders reflected a stubborn belief that Moscow remained within reach, no matter the obstacles. But in reality, the Rasputitsa was draining the Wehrmacht of its most vital resource, time. Every week lost to mud meant the Soviet defenses grew stronger and the shadow of winter loomed closer. Hitler's overconfidence collided headlong with the elements, creating a chasm between ambition and reality. The frontline commanders knew the truth, but dissent had no place in the Reich. The season of mud had become a silent adversary, one Hitler could not defeat with orders or ideology. By late October, the Rasputitsa had reshaped the entire Eastern Front into a battlefield of exhaustion and paralysis. German soldiers staggered through swamps where roads had once been, their vehicles abandoned like skeletons across the landscape. Soviet counterattacks probed weakened flanks, exploiting delays that should never have occurred. Supplies rotted in the mud, rations dwindled, and morale sank as the dream of Moscow grew ever more distant. Yet through the despair, the Germans pushed on, their advance slowed but not entirely broken. The Soviets, meanwhile, prepared for the next phase, understanding that the rains were only a prelude. Winter was coming, and with it a chance to turn defense into counteroffensive. The Rasputitsa had bought the Red Army the most precious of gifts, survival. For the Germans it marked the first true fracture in the illusion of invincibility. The season of mud had turned the tide, not through firepower or strategy, but through the unyielding will of the Russian earth itself. By early November 1941, the German army stood at a crossroads, its advance slowed by mud but not broken in spirit. Commanders at every level scrambled to realign battered divisions, bringing in reinforcements drawn from deep within occupied Europe. Fresh units arrived with enthusiasm, only to find themselves thrust into landscapes littered with wreckage and haunted by the exhaustion of their predecessors. Supply officers worked frantically, struggling to distribute fuel, ammunition, and winter clothing that never seemed to arrive in sufficient quantities. Horses replaced trucks in many areas, their hooves sinking into frozen ground as they hauled artillery and wagons toward the front. The Wehrmacht's vaunted efficiency was crumbling under the sheer distances of the Russian steppe. Yet, amidst hardship, optimism lingered, for Moscow was still visible on their maps and still deemed attainable. Officers rallied their men with promises that one final push would break the Red Army. The mood was grim but not yet resigned. For the Germans, regrouping was both necessity and last gamble. On the ground, soldiers saw little of grand strategy, but felt the weight of renewed orders. Infantrymen were told to clean their rifles and march forward once more, even as frost coated their uniforms. Tank crews patched vehicles that had barely survived the autumn and coaxed engines to life in freezing dawns. Engineers labored day and night to repair bridges and lay makeshift corduroy roads across swamps hardened by ice. Medical staff struggled to treat endless streams of frostbitten men and those weakened by hunger. Their supplies stretched far beyond limits. Field kitchens served thin soups, often cold, while cigarettes became prized treasures traded like currency. Rest was fleeting, with soldiers crammed into barns or dugouts that barely shielded them from the cutting wind. Still, orders came down with urgency. The offensive must resume, and Moscow must fall before the snows thickened. Exhaustion clashed with duty in every man's heart. The regrouping was not only physical but psychological, a battle of endurance against time itself. For the generals, the regrouping was a delicate balancing act of ambition and desperation. They pored over maps, calculating how to shift divisions weakened by weeks of fighting. Panzer armies, once engines of rapid conquest, were reorganized into smaller, more flexible groups to punch through Soviet defenses. Infantry corps were reinforced with replacements, young recruits, older reservists, and men pulled from garrisons across Europe. Yet even as numbers increased, quality declined, and the cracks in the Wehrmacht's power became evident. Fuel shortages dictated the pace of advance, more than orders from Berlin. Ammunition dumps stood perilously far behind the front, vulnerable to Soviet raids and logistical collapse. Still, commanders assured Hitler that Moscow could be reached with one decisive push. Their confidence was as fragile as the ice forming beneath their boots. Regrouping on maps looked clean, but in the mud and frost it was chaos barely disguised as strategy. In Berlin, Hitler demanded results, his obsession with Moscow undimmed by reports of hardship. He dismissed warnings about logistics and weather, insisting the Soviet Union was already collapsing internally. Reinforcements, he declared, would carry the day if properly committed. High command felt his pressure like a noose, their reports carefully worded to avoid angering the Führer. Generals who had argued for a pause knew silence was safer than defiance. Orders came down with ruthless clarity. The attack must resume, and Moscow must be taken before the winter deepened. Hitler spoke of destiny, of crushing the Soviets with a final hammer blow, but his vision overlooked the realities of mud-caked boots, broken tanks, and starving horses. The regrouping was shaped as much by ideology as by military necessity. For Hitler, Moscow remained a prize worth any sacrifice, even if the army itself was breaking apart. For the Soviets, the German regrouping was both feared and anticipated. Soviet intelligence had warned that the Germans were preparing for another push, but no one knew where the hammer would fall. Stalin demanded vigilance, urging his generals to hold firm and not squander their growing reserves. Moscow's defenses were strengthened daily, with new divisions arriving from Siberia and beyond. Yet Red Army soldiers on the front line still felt the pressure of German regrouping, as artillery fire intensified and patrols probed their positions. They knew the Germans had suffered but feared the renewed onslaught could still overwhelm them. Civilians in Moscow listened to whispers of another German advance, even as they dug trenches and prepared barricades in the city streets. Propaganda portrayed German regrouping as a sign of desperation rather than strength. Still, the fear lingered that one last German surge could reach their capital. For the Soviets, the regrouping was a storm cloud gathering on the horizon. Among the German rank and file, regrouping felt less like preparation for victory and more like prolongation of misery. Soldiers muttered in the frozen darkness, questioning why their commanders insisted on pushing toward a city that seemed endlessly out of reach. The promise of victory, once intoxicating, now rang hollow against the reality of empty bellies and frozen limbs. Some longed for rest, others for home, while many simply focused on surviving another day. The regrouping brought no relief, only new orders to march further into a hostile land. Trains carrying reinforcements unloaded fresh faces who quickly realized the front was no place for illusions. Veterans sneered at their optimism, warning that Russia would swallow them whole. The camaraderie of shared suffering bound men together, but despair lingered beneath every conversation. They were regrouping for a fight they no longer fully believed in. The Wehrmacht's spirit was straining, even as it tried to steel itself for another advance. As November wore on, the regrouping transformed into a renewed offensive, but one far more desperate than before. German columns lurched forward, pushing through forests and across half-frozen rivers. Tanks rattled down makeshift roads, their engines groaning in protest at the cold. Infantry advanced through icy winds, bayonets fixed, hoping to break Soviet lines before winter sealed their fate. Every skirmish became harder fought, with Soviet resistance stiffening and counterattacks growing bolder. The Wehrmacht still achieved gains, but each kilometer forward felt like a mile in effort and blood. German soldiers captured villages only to find them burned, their wells poisoned, and their barns empty. Every advance deepened the army's hunger and fatigue. The regrouping had restored the offensive, but it had not restored the momentum of the summer. The dream of Moscow remained, but the cost was mounting with every step. By the end of November, the Germans had regrouped, advanced, and yet failed to break Soviet resolve. The great push toward Moscow continued, but the tempo had slowed to a crawl, and the army bled with every movement. Reinforcements had filled the gaps, but not the spirit of a force stretched to its breaking point. Supplies arrived, but never enough, always too late and too little. Commanders pressed on, haunted by deadlines imposed by weather and Hitler's demands. Soldiers marched through snow-dusted fields, eyes hollow with fatigue, yet still obeying the call to advance. The Soviets, bloodied but unbroken, watched with grim determination as the Germans forced themselves onward. The regrouping had given the Wehrmacht a second wind, but it was thin and fleeting. Winter's grip was closing, and with it came the unraveling of the German gamble. The regrouping was the prelude to a clash of endurance, and time was no longer on Germany's side. By late November 1941, the Wehrmacht's armoured spearheads had reached the threshold of Moscow, a sight that electrified German high command and terrified the Soviet heartland. The distant outline of the Kremlin, with its golden domes and fortified walls, lay within theoretical artillery range of advancing units. For the soldiers on the ground, exhausted and half-frozen, this proximity carried a strange mixture of exhilaration and disbelief. They had fought across half of Russia, through endless fields and burning villages, only to stand at the doorstep of the Soviet Union's most sacred city. Yet the German supply lines stretched thin, fuel convoys lagged far behind, and spare parts for tanks were almost non-existent. Soviet resistance, once thought shattered, continued to bleed the invaders daily with ambushes and counterattacks. German soldiers wrote home claiming victory was imminent, while officers debated whether Moscow would collapse like Paris had in 1940. The propaganda machine in Berlin trumpeted this proximity as proof that Hitler's grand vision was on the verge of fulfillment. Yet in Moscow itself, the reality was one of resolve hardening into defiance rather than despair. The German army had come closer than anyone thought possible, but victory remained elusive, and in the shadows of the city, the Soviet state prepared to gamble everything on survival. For the Soviet leadership, the sight of the enemy so near was a shock unlike any other. Stalin remained in Moscow, refusing to evacuate, despite advisors urging him to relocate eastward for safety. His presence in the city projected both courage and defiance, meant to reassure a shaken population that the capital would not fall. In factories that ran day and night, civilians churned out rifles, ammunition, and tanks under conditions of unimaginable strain. Propaganda broadcasts reminded Muscovites of Napoleon's fate in 1812, when French troops had reached Moscow only to be consumed by winter and resistance. Soldiers in trenches on the outskirts were reminded that behind them stood their families, their homes, and the very heart of the Soviet Union. The fear of collapse was real, but so was the determination to resist, fed by a mixture of patriotism, desperation, and dread of Nazi occupation. Soviet intelligence painted the Wehrmacht as exhausted, its reach exceeding its grasp. The defenses of Moscow became not just a military bulwark, but a symbol of defiance for the entire Eastern Front. And while the Germans celebrated the city being in sight, the Soviets steeled themselves for the hardest fight of all. The soldiers of Army Group Center, advancing toward Moscow, had endured months of ceaseless fighting across thousands of kilometers. Many now marched with worn-out boots, inadequate winter clothing, and little more than frozen bread to sustain them. Vehicles broke down on icy roads, their engines seizing in sub-zero temperatures. The men who manned the tanks often resorted to lighting fires beneath their machines to thaw engines before dawn attacks. German commanders pushed their troops forward relentlessly, convinced that Moscow was the decisive prize that would break the Soviet Union's back. But beneath this veneer of confidence lay creeping doubt, as logistical chaos and Soviet tenacity ground momentum to a halt. German soldiers began to write letters expressing frustration and unease, a stark contrast to earlier triumphalist boasts. They saw comrades collapse from frostbite and exhaustion, reminders that the Eastern Front was not France, nor was Moscow Paris. Snowstorms blurred the horizon, making the city seem both tantalizingly close and impossibly distant. And as the soldiers pressed on, the myth of German invincibility slowly began to unravel beneath the Russian winter sky. Inside Moscow, the mood swung between dread and grim determination. Civilians who had remained were tasked with digging tank traps, trenches, and defensive lines across parks, boulevards, and even Red Square itself. Women, children, and the elderly joined soldiers in fortifying every street that might serve as a battlefield. The clatter of construction mixed with the drone of Soviet loudspeakers, reminding citizens that the defense of Moscow was the defense of the motherland itself. Evacuation trains carried out some of the city's industry, yet much of the production continued within Moscow under constant pressure. Anti-aircraft guns barked into the night, repelling Luftwaffe raids that sought to break morale. For ordinary Muscovites, life became a surreal balance of routine and terror. School lessons in basements, meals cooked from dwindling rations, and evenings spent in blackout conditions. Rumors spread of German troops already on the edge of the city, of tanks seen through the mist, though many such reports were exaggerations or illusions. The population knew little of the Wehrmacht's struggles, only that the enemy stood at the gates. Yet this proximity to destruction seemed to ignite rather than extinguish resolve. Moscow was no longer merely a city, it had become the embodiment of national survival. In German headquarters, Hitler and his generals debated how best to deliver the final blow to Hitler. Moscow represented not just a strategic hub, but the heart of Bolshevik power, the jewel of his ideological war. Capturing it would, he believed, trigger the Soviet Union's collapse, and perhaps force Stalin to sue for peace. His generals, however, warned that their troops were exhausted and that winter was worsening daily. Some urged caution, suggesting the front consolidate before continuing the push, while others pressed for one last desperate effort. Hitler's decision was unwavering. Moscow had to be taken, whatever the cost. Orders went out for renewed assaults, with panzers redirected toward the city's northern and southern flanks. Yet every kilometer forward came at immense expense. In both fuel and blood, the dream of a swift, triumphant march into Red Square began to seem increasingly like a mirage. German optimism collided with the brutal reality of geography, weather, and Soviet resolve. And in those days of uncertainty, the seeds of failure were already being sown. On the front lines, the Soviet defenders experienced a strange duality of despair and unshakable duty. Red Army soldiers dug foxholes in frozen soil, their hands blistered and raw from shovels. They fought in uniforms barely suited for autumn, let alone the plunging temperatures of a Russian winter. Many carried antiquated rifles or shared weapons among comrades, yet their morale was bolstered by the knowledge that they were fighting for their capital. Soviet commanders gave speeches emphasizing the sacredness of Moscow, comparing their stand to the struggles of Russian armies in centuries past. The trenches filled with conversations about family, about fear, and about rumors of reinforcements arriving from the east. At night, artillery thunder illuminated the horizon, painting the sky with flashes of orange against the snow. German advances pressed ever closer, yet the Soviets clung to their positions with ferocious determination. Civilians brought hot soup and bread to the front lines, sharing the burden of defense. In this crucible, Moscow became not just a strategic target but a collective vow: it would not fall. The psychological impact of the Germans reaching Moscow's edge reverberated far beyond the city itself. Across Europe, Axis propaganda heralded it as proof of German supremacy and inevitable victory. In occupied territories, whispers spread that the Soviet Union was finished, its heartland doomed. But among the Allies, there was growing concern that if Moscow fell, the Soviet war effort might collapse entirely, leaving Germany in control of the continent. Roosevelt and Churchill followed developments anxiously, offering words of support and promises of aid. Within the Soviet Union, however, the perception was different. The very proximity of the enemy intensified the struggle, feeding both fear and determination. Stalin used the crisis to rally the nation, delivering speeches that framed the defense of Moscow as a battle for civilization itself. German soldiers might see the Kremlin towers through their binoculars, but for the Soviets, that sight only reinforced the urgency of resistance. The clash became more than a contest of arms. It was a contest of will, and in that contest, the Soviet spirit hardened like steel against the winter frost. As December loomed, Moscow stood precariously on the edge of disaster and defiance. The German army had come within sight of its target, yet the city remained unbroken. Snow fell heavier each day, blanketing the battlefield and slowing every movement. German troops, lacking proper winter equipment, shivered in trenches while Soviet forces adapted to the freezing conditions. The front lines became static, frozen as much by weather as by resistance. Inside Moscow, the people braced themselves for siege, uncertain whether the next week would bring destruction or salvation. And yet, even in this darkest hour, the Soviet Union prepared for its counterstroke, marshalling reserves hidden from German eyes. The fate of the capital hung in the balance, suspended between collapse and endurance. For both sides, the battle for Moscow had become a test of resolve that transcended military logic. And as the world watched, the outcome of Operation Typhoon balanced on a knife's edge, with history poised to turn in the snowbound fields before the Soviet capital. As the Wehrmacht pressed closer to Moscow in the winter of 1941, the Soviet Union turned to its most distant reserves, thousands of kilometers away in the frozen expanses of Siberia. These divisions had been stationed in the Far East for years, poised to defend against a possible Japanese invasion that never came. Only after intelligence confirmed Tokyo's decision to look southward, toward the Pacific, could Stalin afford to move these troops westward. Their arrival represented not only a transfer of men but of hope, a surge of strength at a time when the Red Army in the capital reeled under immense pressure. Trains roared across the continent, carrying fresh regiments through snow-covered plains and endless forests. Each locomotive was a lifeline, a steel artery pumping new blood into a battered body. The men aboard wore heavy white camouflage suits, fur-lined boots, and thick winter uniforms, gear starkly different from the thin coats of soldiers already in the fight. Unlike the exhausted defenders of Moscow, these Siberians were rested, well-trained, and hardened by years of life in unforgiving climates. They carried with them not just rifles and machine guns, but the discipline of frontier soldiers accustomed to extremes. Their deployment would soon prove decisive in turning the tide of the battle for Moscow. The story of their arrival began not in the Urals or the steppes, but in the offices of Soviet intelligence. Agents embedded in Tokyo reported that Japan, despite its alliance with Germany, would not strike north into Siberia, but would instead expand south into the Pacific. This information gave Stalin the confidence to shift divisions that had been his eastern shield, releasing them at a moment of existential crisis. For months, he had hesitated, fearing a two-front disaster that would collapse the Soviet Union entirely. But with certainty now delivered, he acted decisively, ordering entire corps onto trains bound for the west. The sheer scale of the movement was staggering. Tens of thousands of men, countless artillery pieces, and columns of tanks rolling across the frozen rails. The logistical challenge was immense, with fuel, food, and coordination stretched to the limit. Yet the Soviet system, brutal but efficient, made the impossible possible. In the bitter nights of December, the first Siberian formations began to arrive on the outskirts of Moscow. Their timing was perfect, coinciding with the moment when German strength faltered under snow, frost, and exhaustion. From the east came salvation, and with it, a renewed sense of purpose. To the people of Moscow, the sight of these soldiers was almost mythic. Civilians, worn down by months of digging trenches and enduring air raids, watched trains unload men who seemed carved from ice and iron. The Siberians wore fur hats pulled low, their rifles slung with practiced ease, and their eyes carried a calm confidence that inspired those around them. They were not untested recruits, but veterans of endless drills in snowdrifts and frozen forests. Tales spread quickly through the capital that these men were unstoppable, that they could fight in conditions that would paralyze the enemy. Children gathered at rail stations to glimpse the newcomers, while old women crossed themselves in quiet relief. For Muscovites who had feared the city's imminent fall, the arrival of Siberian divisions was a visible sign that the balance was shifting. Soldiers already on the front lines felt their morale rise, knowing reinforcements had come not only in numbers but in quality. These were not men beaten down by retreat, but fresh warriors arriving with fire in their hearts. Their presence radiated strength, a living promise that Moscow would not be surrendered. The capital exhaled, if only for a moment. For the German soldiers facing them, the Siberians became a nightmare. Used to driving back Soviet units ragged from months of retreat, the Wehrmacht now encountered troops who fought with precision, stamina, and an almost alien ability to endure the cold. Siberian infantry counterattacked in snowstorms, moving silently through blizzards while their enemies stumbled and froze. Their white camouflage made them phantoms, appearing suddenly out of drifts to unleash fire at point-blank range. Ski troops, trained to glide over the snow with uncanny speed, harassed German flanks and struck supply lines. Artillery from the east, manned by practiced crews, laid down devastating barrages that shattered advancing units. For the first time since June, the Germans sensed that the Soviets were no longer merely resisting but seizing the initiative. Letters home began to carry darker tones, speaking of enemies who seemed born from the very winter itself. The Siberians' ferocity, combined with their preparation, pierced the myth of German invincibility, and slowly, the Wehrmacht began to feel not like the hunter but the hunted. Behind the Siberian soldiers lay stories of extraordinary endurance. These men had grown up in climates where the thermometer plunged to levels unimaginable to most Europeans. They hunted in snow, lived in log cabins, and learned survival as part of daily life. To them, temperatures that froze German machine guns were simply familiar conditions. Commanders who had trained these troops emphasized not only discipline but toughness, forging units that thrived where others withered. Their uniforms reflected that reality: thick, insulated coats, felt boots, and layered gear that kept frostbite at bay. Each soldier carried not just weapons but survival skills, how to light fires in blizzards, how to march for days across frozen rivers, how to fight without losing momentum in sub-zero weather. These abilities translated directly into combat effectiveness, giving them an edge in the nightmare landscape outside Moscow. They were, in a sense, the Soviet Union's secret weapon, not forged in factories, but in the endless winters of the Far East, and when unleashed against the Germans, their resilience became as deadly as their rifles. At the strategic level, their arrival marked a turning point in the balance of power around Moscow. Zhukov, now commanding the defense of the capital, understood exactly how to use these fresh forces. He placed them at critical junctions where German assaults had thinned Soviet lines and positioned them as shock troops for impending counteroffensives. Entire divisions were tasked with striking at German spearheads that had overreached, cutting them off from support. The Siberians did not merely hold ground, they pushed forward, clawing back villages and crossroads that had been lost weeks earlier. Each gain, however small, chipped away at German confidence and tightened Soviet control over the battlefield. Hitler's grand vision of Moscow, within his grasp, began to fade under the weight of this fresh Soviet strength. German generals, already despairing over logistics and weather, now faced enemies who fought with renewed vigor and unrelenting pressure. What had been intended as the final lunge toward the Kremlin became a slow retreat. The Siberians were more than reinforcements. They were the instrument of a shift in momentum. On the ground, the clash between Siberian troops and German soldiers was brutal and unrelenting. Battles were fought in snowbound villages, where log houses burned and tanks froze in place. At Borodino, at Klin, at dozens of nameless crossroads, the Siberians charged through ice-crusted fields with bayonets fixed. German machine guns rattled, but the attackers pressed on, shielded by snowbanks and driven by relentless determination. Many fell, but more surged forward, overwhelming positions thought impregnable. Their attacks were coordinated with artillery thunder and the drone of Soviet aircraft that finally regained the skies as winter grounded much of the Luftwaffe. Prisoners taken by the Germans spoke of fighting for their homes, their comrades, and their capital with a fervor that unnerved interrogators. Each clash left fields littered with burned-out tanks and bodies frozen in grotesque poses beneath the falling snow. Yet the Siberians kept advancing, absorbing casualties, but never breaking. They transformed the battlefield from a zone of German dominance into a theater of Soviet resurgence. In the larger narrative of the war, the arrival of the Siberian divisions symbolized the Soviet Union's ability to survive when survival seemed impossible. They came not only as soldiers but as a message that the vastness of Russia itself could summon armies from its distant reaches, inexhaustible and unexpected. For Stalin, their deployment was vindication of his gamble, a reminder that intelligence, timing, and will could shift the tide of history. For the defenders of Moscow, they were the embodiment of salvation, arriving at the darkest hour to hold the line. For the Germans, they were the heralds of defeat, the first clear sign that the march east had limits. As snow fell heavier and the year drew to a close, these troops turned the story of Moscow from looming catastrophe into defiance and endurance. Their arrival would not only save the Soviet capital, but reshape the war on the Eastern Front. The myth of invincibility, so carefully built by the Wehrmacht, cracked under the weight of Siberian steel and determination, and from that moment onward the initiative began to shift, not just for Moscow, but for the entire struggle against Nazi Germany. By late November 1941, the Russian winter descended with a ferocity unmatched in living memory, smothering the front lines in a grip of unrelenting ice. Temperatures plummeted well below freezing, often reaching levels that froze exposed skin in minutes. German soldiers, many still dressed in thin autumn uniforms, shivered in foxholes that offered little protection against the biting winds. They wrapped themselves in scarves torn from civilian homes, in blankets scavenged from villages, and even in newspapers stuffed beneath tunics for insulation. Weapons, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, stiffened under frost, their moving parts seizing when oil congealed into sludge. Tanks, left idling through the night, often refused to start by dawn, their engines locked solid by ice. Horses, the backbone of German supply columns, collapsed in the snow, their bodies frozen stiff within hours. Campfires became luxuries, often doused by artillery or extinguished by the endless blizzard winds. What had begun as an unstoppable march toward Moscow now turned into a test of survival, as the elements proved more merciless than the enemy. The German High Command had gambled on a quick victory, never imagining that their armies would remain on the Eastern Front through the depths of winter. Logistics officers had failed to prepare for clothing suitable to the Russian climate, leaving soldiers ill-equipped against temperatures that dipped below -30 degrees Celsius. Supply trains that once carried ammunition and fuel now desperately attempted to bring coats, mittens, and boots from factories in Germany, yet the effort came too late, too little, and too sporadic to meet the vast needs of millions of men spread across hundreds of miles. Soldiers cut makeshift felt liners from sacks to pad their boots, yet frostbite claimed toes and fingers in terrifying numbers. Entire divisions reported thousands of non-combat casualties, not from bullets or shells but from the cold itself. The sick and frostbitten filled aid stations that had no medicine, only rags to wrap wounds and straw to cover the dying. Letters home became grim accounts of endless suffering, morale cracking as hope of warmth faded. The mighty Wehrmacht found itself humbled, not by the Red Army alone, but by the Russian winter that seemed allied with its people. Machinery, which had once been the decisive edge of blitzkrieg, faltered under the strain of sub-zero conditions. Tanks rolled forward, only to break down as gears cracked and lubricants froze solid. Trucks carrying food and ammunition sank into snowdrifts, immobilized until desperate soldiers hauled supplies by hand or with sledges. Machine guns, once instruments of deadly precision, jammed after a few bursts, their barrels locked with ice. Artillery crews struggled to wheel their frozen guns into position, the steel shuddering under the stress of firing in the bitter cold. Even radios, vital for coordination, fell silent when batteries drained lifeless in the frigid air. The Germans had relied on speed and mobility to outmaneuver their foes, but the Russian winter stripped away these advantages with merciless efficiency. What remained was an army bogged down, choking on its own immobility. For many frontline soldiers, the question shifted from victory to endurance, from conquest to the sheer will to survive another night. Each dawn revealed more frozen corpses, reminders of how quickly the cold punished the unprepared. For the ordinary German infantryman, daily existence became a battle against an invisible enemy. In trenches filled with snow, they rubbed frostbitten fingers together, trying to maintain sensation as rifles slipped from numbed hands. Rations arrived frozen solid, bread transformed into blocks that required hatchets to cut, soup stiff as ice before it touched the spoon. Soldiers huddled together in barns or dugouts, their breath clouding the air like smoke, yet sleep brought little relief as the cold gnawed endlessly. Frostbite turned flesh black, forcing field surgeons to amputate limbs with saws heated over fires. Men who had once marched proudly in goose step now stumbled, hunched, dragging feet that no longer obeyed their will. Deserters were rare, not because of loyalty, but because there was nowhere to run in the endless snowfields. The brutality of nature leveled all ranks. Privates and officers alike froze in their coats, sharing the same misery. In whispered conversations, men cursed Berlin for sending them into this wasteland unprepared. To them, Moscow now seemed not a prize to be taken, but a death trap waiting to consume them. While German morale sank, Soviet resilience hardened. Moscow's defenders, though battered and bloodied, had the advantage of familiarity with their homeland's winters. Civilians knitted mittens and woolen socks for soldiers. Factories worked day and night to produce sheepskin coats, and troops were equipped with gear designed for subarctic survival. Red Army units adapted quickly, camouflaging in white uniforms that blended seamlessly with the snow. Their rifles rarely froze, as oil was replaced with special mixtures suited for the climate. Ski battalions moved with ghostly speed across the drifts, striking German positions where mobility was impossible. For the Soviets, the cold was not merely an obstacle, it was a weapon wielded as effectively as artillery or armor. Soldiers joked bitterly that General Winter fought on their side, inflicting more casualties on the invaders than any Soviet division could manage alone. For the first time since June, Soviet confidence swelled as nature itself seemed to conspire with their cause. The tide of morale shifted, and with it the balance of the campaign. In German headquarters, despair clashed with denial. Reports flooded in of men freezing in their foxholes, of divisions rendered combat ineffective, not by Soviet firepower, but by the weather. Commanders pleaded for winter equipment, yet the factories of the Reich could not produce enough in time to reach the front. Hitler, consumed by his vision of Moscow, dismissed many complaints as weakness, insisting that his soldiers must show willpower to overcome adversity. Yet even he could not ignore the photographs of frostbitten soldiers, their faces bandaged, their bodies crippled before a single bullet struck. The Wehrmacht aura of invincibility cracked as news spread through Europe of its armies stalled, its men suffering. For the Allies, these stories were proof that Germany was not unstoppable, that the Eastern Front could bleed the Reich dry. Inside the German ranks, whispers of doubt began to ripple, undermining faith in a swift end to the war. Winter had slowed not just tanks and trucks, but the very momentum of conquest. The offensive spirit, once unstoppable, now froze in place like the rivers and fields that surrounded them. Among the Soviet people, the winter inspired both dread and determination. Civilians endured hardships almost as severe as the soldiers, their homes unheated, their food rationed to starvation levels, yet they drew strength from watching the invaders suffer. Propaganda posters depicted German soldiers freezing in the snow, portraying the cold as a patriotic ally. Radio broadcasts told stories of peasants helping Red Army ski patrols ambush German convoys, turning weather into a tactical advantage. In Moscow, workers labored under blizzards to keep railways open, ensuring supplies reached the front, despite the storms. The population, already hardened by months of war, saw the suffering of their enemies as vindication. For them, the winter was proof that the land itself resisted occupation, that Russia's very climate defended its heart, and though they endured famine, frost, and fear, they clung to the belief that survival equaled victory. The longer they endured, the closer the chance came that the invaders would break. By December, the front lines of Operation Typhoon resembled a frozen graveyard, stretching from horizon to horizon. Fields lay littered with motionless tanks, their barrels pointing skyward like monuments to a stalled campaign. Horses, stiff with ice, stood as grim statues in the snow, carts still harnessed to their lifeless bodies. Soldiers, buried in shallow trenches, huddled against winds that howled through the night like wolves. The German dream of storming Moscow before winter had collapsed into a nightmare of attrition and suffering. What began as a calculated offensive now became a desperate struggle to hold positions against an enemy growing stronger by the day. Morale cracked as men questioned why they fought in this frozen wasteland, so far from home. In contrast, Soviet strength only deepened, bolstered by reinforcements, by the Siberians, and by the endless resolve of a people who refused to surrender their capital. Winter had chosen its side, and with every passing day, the balance of the war tilted further against the Reich. Moscow still stood, and now it would strike back. In the darkest days of late 1941, as German armies closed in on the Soviet capital, whispers spread through Moscow that the government might abandon the city. Officials evacuated ministries, archives, and entire industries eastward to the Urals, a visible sign that the state prepared for the worst. Rumors circulated that Stalin himself had fled, vanishing from the Kremlin as enemy artillery drew ever closer. Yet the reality was starkly different, for Stalin remained in Moscow ensconced in his offices, refusing to leave the heart of the Soviet Union. His decision defied not only military logic, but also the instincts of self-preservation, for he knew capture or death awaited if the city fell. For many in his inner circle, his choice seemed reckless, bordering on suicidal, yet for Stalin it was a deliberate act of defiance. He understood that if he abandoned Moscow, the morale of his people and his army would collapse like a house of cards. His personal presence in the city became a weapon, as powerful as divisions of troops or batteries of artillery. And in those uncertain days, symbolism carried weight equal to steel and gunpowder. On November 7th, the anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, Stalin made a decision that would shape both perception and history. Against the advice of generals who warned of German air raids and advancing troops, he ordered a military parade to be held on Red Square. Tanks rumbled across cobblestones, soldiers marched in precise formation, and the iconic Kremlin towers loomed in the background, all under the threat of enemy bombardment. Stalin appeared before the troops, standing resolute, his voice carried through loudspeakers to soldiers and citizens alike. His speech invoked the memory of Russian heroes, from Alexander Nevsky to Dmitry Donskoy, framing the struggle not only as a defense of socialism, but as a continuation of centuries of Russian resilience. He promised the enemy would be driven back, that Moscow would not fall, and that the motherland demanded sacrifice. Soldiers cheered, their shouts echoing across Red Square, their eyes burning with renewed determination. Many of these men would march directly from the parade to the front lines, where some would meet death within days. Yet for them, Stalin's defiance transformed fear into pride, and despair into resolve. The symbolism of Stalin remaining in Moscow was not lost on the population, who watched their leader stand firm while so many officials fled. Families huddled in basements, listening to radios crackling with his words, drawing strength from his refusal to abandon them. Mothers whispered to children that their leader would not leave, so neither should they give in to fear. Even among skeptics and critics of the regime, Stalin's choice commanded a grudging respect, for it showed a unity of fate between the ruler and the ruled. Propaganda posters and newspapers magnified the image of Stalin as a steadfast father figure, anchoring the Soviet Union through the storm. The impact went beyond Moscow's borders, for Soviet soldiers at the front learned their leader was sharing their danger. Rumors of evacuation had died, replaced with stories of determination that spread like fire through trenches and barracks. In a war where morale often determined survival, Stalin's presence in the capital became a decisive psychological weapon. The city no longer felt like a doomed fortress, but a rallying point for resistance. And in that unity, the seeds of survival were planted. Internationally, Stalin's decision reverberated with equal force. British and American diplomats, still uncertain of the Soviet Union's durability, reported back with astonishment that Stalin had chosen to stay in a city under siege. For Allied leaders, this act suggested a tenacity that demanded continued support, bolstering arguments for sending weapons, aircraft, and supplies. Radio broadcasts carried Stalin's defiant words beyond Soviet borders, framing Moscow as the front line of global resistance against fascism. In London, newspapers drew parallels between Moscow's defense and Britain's survival during the Blitz, portraying Stalin's refusal to flee as akin to Churchill's vow to fight on the beaches. In Washington, Roosevelt noted that the Soviet leader's decision revealed an iron will that might yet hold back the German tide. For neutral countries, it showed that the Soviet regime was not collapsing as many had expected. The narrative of inevitability, so carefully cultivated by German propaganda, was suddenly fractured. Stalin's gamble not only stabilized his nation, but reshaped perceptions of Soviet strength across the world. For Soviet soldiers dug into icy trenches outside Moscow, the knowledge that Stalin remained in the city gave their struggle new meaning. They fought not only for their homes and families, but for a capital whose leader shared their fate. Stories spread among the ranks that Stalin walked the Kremlin walls at night, surveying the fires on the horizon, standing guard with them in spirit. Whether true or not, such tales inspired men facing frostbite, hunger, and relentless artillery fire. Commissars reminded them in speeches that their leader had not fled, so they too must hold the line. For many, this transformed their suffering into sacrifice, and their resistance into destiny. The German invaders were no longer just fighting an army. They were fighting an entire nation unified under the shadow of their capital. This psychological bond proved as vital as rifles or tanks, giving Soviet forces the strength to endure when logic said they should collapse. In the frozen wastelands outside Moscow, morale became the true weapon of war, sharpened by Stalin's decision to remain. Yet the decision carried immense risk, for if Moscow had fallen, Stalin would have shared its fate. His enemies within the Politburo whispered their doubts, some fearing that the entire Soviet Union could collapse with his capture. The NKVD reinforced security measures, preparing for assassination attempts, while anti-aircraft batteries ringed the Kremlin in anticipation of Luftwaffe raids. Stalin accepted these dangers with calculated resolve, knowing that retreat would be more damaging than death. His presence bound the people to the city, but it also bound his own life to its survival. German generals, aware of his defiance, privately admitted that Stalin's presence stiffened Soviet resolve, making the campaign far more difficult than anticipated. The battle for Moscow thus became more than a military struggle. It became a contest of wills between Hitler's vision of conquest and Stalin's refusal to yield. In this duel of personalities, the morale of millions hung in the balance. One man's decision not to flee altered the course of the war more than armies alone could have achieved. Propaganda transformed Stalin's choice into legend almost instantly. Posters appeared showing him at Red Square, towering over soldiers like a patriarchal guardian of the nation. Newspapers printed photographs of the parade, portraying it as a symbol of defiance unmatched in modern history. Radio broadcasts replayed his speech endlessly, embedding his words into the minds of citizens across the Soviet Union. Even in occupied territories, whispers of Stalin's decision filtered through, carried by partisans who framed it as proof that the Soviet Union was not broken. This blending of fact and myth created an aura that elevated him beyond politics into the realm of historical destiny. For a people enduring starvation, frost, and bombardment, such imagery offered hope when little else could. The war was not merely about tanks and divisions, but about spirit and resolve, and Stalin's act embodied both. Through propaganda, his decision multiplied its impact, shaping perception as much as reality, and in war, perception often dictated outcome. In the end, Stalin's refusal to leave Moscow became one of the defining symbols of the Soviet defense. It tied his fate inseparably to that of the city, binding ruler and people in a moment of shared struggle. His speech at Red Square, given under the shadow of possible annihilation, resonated not only in Moscow but across the vast front lines stretching thousands of miles. The soldiers who marched past him into battle carried his words in their hearts, even as many never returned. Civilians drew strength from knowing that their leader endured the same dangers they faced. International observers recognized the act as a turning point in the psychological war between fascism and communism. For Hitler, the defiance of his rival underscored the monumental task still ahead, proving that Moscow would not collapse like Paris or Warsaw. In history's lens, the decision elevated Stalin from a political leader to a wartime symbol, inseparable from the survival of the Soviet Union itself. And as winter deepened, that symbolism became as potent as the guns that roared along the frozen front. In December 1941, as temperatures plunged to levels that defied human endurance, the tide of war outside Moscow shifted with startling suddenness. For months the Wehrmacht had driven relentlessly eastward, convinced the Soviet capital would collapse under the weight of German might. But now, with German troops weakened by frostbite, hunger, and exhaustion, the Soviets prepared to strike back with ferocity. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, entrusted with the defense of Moscow, had gathered fresh divisions from the Far East and reserves hidden in the city's depths. At dawn on December 5th, artillery thundered across frozen fields, announcing that the Soviet counteroffensive had begun. Soldiers who had once been on the defensive now surged forward with bayonets fixed, their breath rising like steam in the bitter cold. Tanks, painted white to blend with snow, rumbled across fields hardened into ice. For the first time since the German invasion began, it was the Red Army that advanced, not retreated, and in that moment, the myth of German invincibility began to shatter. The counteroffensive was no mere local action, but a massive operation stretching across hundreds of miles of front, from Kharlin in the north to Tula in the south. Entire Soviet armies surged against stunned German lines. The Siberian divisions, hardened by subarctic winters, moved with a speed and resilience that astonished their German opponents. They fought with padded white uniforms, skis strapped to their feet, and rifles slung across their backs, striking where the enemy least expected. Cavalry units galloped across snowbound plains, sabers flashing as they cut through isolated German detachments. For German soldiers, already reduced to wrapping rags around their frozen feet, the sight of well-prepared Soviet forces was both bewildering and terrifying. Entire sectors of the German front buckled, collapsing into chaotic retreats as commanders struggled to form new defensive lines. The initiative, once firmly in German hands, had slipped away. For the first time, Hitler's soldiers tasted the bitterness of retreat on the Eastern Front, and the scale of their disarray would echo across the entire war. At the spearhead of this counteroffensive were Soviet tank brigades that had lain hidden in reserve until the decisive moment. T-34 says, their wide tracks perfectly suited for snowbound terrain, smashed into German panzer divisions that struggled to maneuver in the frozen mud. The mechanical reliability of the Soviet tanks contrasted sharply with the breakdowns plaguing German machines, many of which had been designed for European roads, not Russian winters. Infantry followed closely behind, advancing through blizzards, supported by Katyusha rocket launchers that lit up the night sky with arcs of fire. German officers who had once scoffed at Soviet equipment now admitted its rugged effectiveness. Towns and villages once lost in the autumn offensive were retaken, often in brutal close-quarters combat. Civilians emerged from hiding, watching in disbelief as Soviet banners replaced swastikas on rooftops. Each regained settlement was more than a tactical victory. It was a symbol that the tide of destruction could be reversed, and with every village liberated, the confidence of Soviet troops grew. The shock to German command was profound, for they had not anticipated a Soviet strike in such scale or strength. Intelligence had underestimated Soviet reserves, convinced the Red Army had been bled dry at Vyazma and Bryansk, but Stalin and Zhukov had held back divisions for this very moment, conserving strength while German forces exhausted themselves. Now Hitler's armies faced a nightmare scenario, an enemy rejuvenated by reinforcements and motivated by survival. The German frontline soldiers were forced into retreat across snow-choked forests and frozen rivers, leaving behind wrecks of vehicles and piles of dead. Commanders tried to rally their men, but morale crumbled as rumors spread that Moscow was no longer within reach. German propaganda, once boasting of inevitable victory, now fell silent. Reports sent back to Berlin painted a grim picture of collapsing lines and armies pushed backward. For the first time since the invasion began, Hitler faced a defeat he could not ignore, and the aura of invincibility that surrounded the Wehrmacht began to erode. For Soviet soldiers, the counteroffensive was both exhilarating and brutal. Many marched barefoot in frozen boots, their faces wrapped in cloth against the cutting winds, yet the chance to strike back gave them renewed energy. They pushed forward despite frostbite gnawing at fingers and toes, despite ammunition shortages and the ever-present hunger. Letters from home, written in trembling hands, told them that Moscow still stood and their families still endured. These personal reminders fueled their determination to press onward. Soldiers spoke of a new confidence, a belief that the Red Army could not only defend but also reclaim. The counterattack was more than strategy. It was an act of psychological liberation. For every German soldier driven back, there was a Soviet fighter who felt his sacrifice had meaning. And in the bleakest winter Europe had seen in generations, that sense of purpose became their greatest weapon. The world beyond the Soviet Union watched events with astonishment. In London, Churchill hailed the Soviet resilience, recognizing that Hitler's armies were no longer unstoppable. In Washington, Roosevelt's government saw the counteroffensive as proof that Lend-Lease support had reached a vital partner worth sustaining. Propaganda in Allied nations highlighted Soviet victories, portraying them as the first great reversal of Nazi power. Newspapers carried stories of German retreat, contrasting them with earlier boasts of quick victory. Even in neutral countries, the perception shifted. The Soviet Union was not collapsing, but rising from the brink of destruction. For occupied peoples across Europe, the sight of German failure in the East became a spark of hope. If Moscow could resist, perhaps liberation was possible. And in the global contest of morale, the Soviet counteroffensive carried weight far beyond the battlefield. Yet the counteroffensive was not without cost. For Soviet losses remained staggering. Entire regiments vanished in blizzards, swallowed by hunger, cold, and unrelenting combat. Supply lines strained as food and ammunition struggled to reach advancing troops over broken roads. Frostbite claimed as many men as German bullets, and medical units were overwhelmed with the wounded. Still, Soviet command pressed forward, unwilling to let momentum slip away. The Germans were forced back over 100 miles from Moscow, losing ground that had been won at immense expense. Villages were burned, forests littered with the carcasses of tanks and horses, and rivers choked with ice and bodies. The front became a frozen wasteland of suffering, where victory was measured not in territory alone, but in survival. Despite the staggering price, the Soviets had proven a critical point. The German war machine could be stopped, and in that truth lay the foundation of ultimate victory. By the end of December 1941, the Red Army had transformed the battlefield outside Moscow from a German springboard into a Soviet bastion. Zhukov's counteroffensive had driven the invaders back, shattering their aura of inevitability and forcing Hitler into the first strategic retreat of the war. For soldiers who had once feared annihilation, the sight of Germans fleeing through snowdrifts was a vindication of sacrifice and endurance. Stalin declared the victory as a symbol of Soviet resilience, a testament to the strength of the people and their army. The myth of German invincibility lay broken in the snows before Moscow's gates. The world now knew the Soviet Union would not collapse, and that Hitler's grand vision of conquest was flawed. The counteroffensive did not end the war, but it marked a turning point in its course. In the icy winds of December, history shifted, and the Red Army, once clinging to survival, had taken the first steps toward ultimate triumph. The winter of 1941 forced the Wehrmacht into an unfamiliar and humiliating position: retreat. For the first time since the Blitzkrieg campaigns that had swept across Europe, German troops were pushed backward, their momentum broken. Exhausted divisions that had once dreamed of parading through Red Square now staggered through snowbound forests, pursued by relentless Soviet forces. Commanders scrambled to stabilize a crumbling front, ordering hasty withdrawals under constant pressure. Soldiers burned equipment they could not carry, leaving charred vehicles and abandoned guns in their wake. Villages once used as German headquarters were torched to deny shelter to advancing Soviets. The retreat was chaotic, marked by confusion, desperation, and the cold bite of fear. For men who had marched with iron confidence, the realization that Moscow was beyond their grasp was devastating, and as the front shifted westward, the myth of German invincibility cracked beneath the weight of reality. Defensive lines were established in haste, often chosen more by geography than by strategy. Rivers and frozen ridges became anchors of defense, where weary soldiers dug trenches into permafrost with bleeding hands. Panzer crews, once the spearhead of attack, now found themselves fighting rearguard actions, buying time for infantry to withdraw. Supply wagons bogged down in snow, while horses, overworked and underfed, collapsed in their traces. Communications faltered, with orders delayed or lost as field radios froze solid. Yet amidst the chaos, German discipline remained remarkable, units reforming again and again, even under extreme duress. Officers barked orders with icy determination, desperate to prevent rout from turning into collapse. Makeshift barricades of logs, ice, and rubble dotted the landscape, symbolic of an army clinging to survival. Every kilometer ceded felt like a betrayal of their earlier triumphs, and every step back brought the shadow of Hitler's wrath closer. At the front, soldiers experienced a kind of suffering they had never imagined during the victorious campaigns of 1939 and 1940. Frostbite gnawed at ears, noses, and fingers, leaving men crippled before they even saw battle. Rifles jammed as grease froze inside their mechanisms, forcing desperate soldiers to urinate on bolts to thaw them. Uniforms designed for autumn campaigns provided little protection against temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. Ammunition stocks dwindled, rations shrank to crusts of bread, and morale collapsed alongside the crumbling front lines. Men who had once believed the war would end in months now muttered bitter curses against distant leaders. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, despair, and an encroaching sense of doom. For many, the retreat was not just a tactical reversal but a psychological rupture. They felt abandoned by their own generals and betrayed by fate, and in their misery, the seeds of future defeat were sown. Inside German command, the mood was one of shock and disbelief. Reports of Soviet advances contradicted earlier assumptions that the Red Army had been crushed. Field marshals, desperate to save their armies, urged withdrawals to defensible positions far behind the front. But in Berlin, Hitler's fury boiled over. his voice echoing in conference rooms as he condemned his generals for cowardice. He demanded that no ground be ceded, declaring that soldiers must stand fast regardless of cost. For commanders in the field, these orders bordered on lunacy, yet defiance carried the risk of dismissal, or worse. The tension between operational reality and political command grew sharper with every passing day. Generals who had once basked in Hitler's victories now found themselves scapegoats for his failures, and as the Red Army pressed forward, the divide between Berlin's rhetoric and the battlefield's truth widened into a chasm. Hitler's reaction was not only anger but obsession. He believed retreat endangered his aura of infallibility, the very foundation of his control over Germany. To him, every step backward was a betrayal of his vision of a 1,000-year Reich. He ordered reinforcements rushed to the front, though few were available, and fewer still were prepared for Russian winter. New defensive lines were to be held to the last man, regardless of terrain or supply. Officers who spoke of reality were silenced, their warnings dismissed as defeatism. Hitler moved ever deeper into micromanagement, dictating troop movements on maps thousands of miles from the front. His insistence on rigid defense condemned thousands to unnecessary suffering. For the soldiers enduring the retreat, these orders felt detached from the misery of frozen battlefields. And as they dug in once more, they realized survival had become the only measure of success. On the Soviet side, the retreat of the Wehrmacht carried immense symbolic weight. Civilians who had suffered under German occupation watched in astonishment as the enemy withdrew, abandoning villages they once ruled with arrogance. Soviet soldiers, hardened by months of defense, pursued with renewed vigor, striking at German columns with bayonets and artillery. Captured positions revealed abandoned German equipment, once feared as unstoppable, now rusting in the snow. For the Red Army, this was vindication, the proof that their sacrifices had not been in vain. Propaganda posters appeared in Moscow and Leningrad, proclaiming the invaders' weakness and urging greater effort. Stalin seized the moment to remind his people that Germany was not invincible and that the Soviet Union could endure. In every retreating column, the Germans carried humiliation, and in every advancing step, the Soviets carried hope. The retreat reshaped the Eastern Front in ways that would define the rest of the war. German divisions that had once been poised for conquest were now forced into a desperate struggle for survival. Supply lines shortened but grew fragile, stretched thin across hostile territory where partisans struck with growing boldness. The grand strategy of blitzkrieg had collapsed in the snow, replaced by static lines and desperate improvisation. Soviet commanders sensed the change, pressing harder with every opportunity, unwilling to let the enemy recover. In German towns and villages far from the front, news of retreat sent ripples of unease through a population accustomed to victory. Families feared for sons and husbands fighting in conditions beyond imagination. The war, once distant and triumphant, now seemed endless and uncertain, and the seeds of eventual German defeat were quietly planted in the snowdrifts outside Moscow. By the close of winter, the Wehrmacht stood bloodied and battered, no longer the unstoppable juggernaut that had swept through Europe. Retreat had scarred the army's pride and revealed vulnerabilities that could no longer be hidden. German soldiers clung to their rifles in makeshift trenches, praying for spring and the chance to regroup. Their leaders argued over strategy, torn between Hitler's demands and battlefield realities. In Moscow, Stalin proclaimed victory, casting the counteroffensive as proof of Soviet resilience and destiny. Across the world, the image of German power was shaken, and the myth of invincibility shattered. The retreat did not yet mean defeat, but it marked a turning point that echoed through every barracks and every government hall. For the first time, the Reich had been stopped, forced back by an enemy it had underestimated. And in the endless snows of Russia, history had turned against Hitler's armies. The Battle of Moscow was more than a clash of armies. It was the first great crack in the myth of German invincibility. Until that winter of 1941, the Wehrmacht had stormed across Europe, toppling governments and smashing armies with breathtaking speed. From Warsaw to Paris, their campaign seemed unstoppable, and their generals were celebrated as modern military geniuses. Yet outside the gates of Moscow, amid snowdrifts and temperatures colder than anything German soldiers had ever endured, the story changed. For the first time, Hitler's armies were not advancing but reeling back, their ambitions frozen in the Russian winter. The Soviet counteroffensive sent shockwaves across the world, proving that the Red Army was far from destroyed. Civilians in occupied Europe whispered that the Reich might not be invulnerable after all. Allied capitals seized on the news, broadcasting it as a turning of the tide, and in the trenches, soldiers on both sides sensed that history itself had shifted. For Germany, the failure before Moscow shattered a dream deeply tied to Hitler's vision of total victory. The Führer had promised his people that the Soviet Union would collapse within months, reduced to rubble by the fury of blitzkrieg. Instead, the campaign bogged down in snow and mud, its soldiers half-starved, its tanks frozen in place. German propaganda tried to mask the setback, describing it as a temporary withdrawal, but the truth was impossible to hide. Families received letters describing frostbite, exhaustion, and comrades left behind in shallow graves. Commanders who once spoke confidently now whispered of attrition and impossible odds. Even among the elite SS units, morale darkened as victories turned to stalemates. The aura of certainty that had carried the Wehrmacht forward evaporated in the icy fields outside Moscow, and with it, the German people began to realize that the war would be longer, harder, and bloodier than they had ever been told. For the Soviet Union, the battle became a defining moment of survival and defiance. Stalin declared that Moscow had been saved by the courage of its soldiers, the resilience of its people, and the unyielding will of socialism. In truth, the defense was a mosaic of desperate measures, sacrifices, and sheer determination, stitched together under immense pressure. Civilians who had dug trenches, soldiers who had fought with little sleep or food, and commanders who had endured endless nights of planning, all became part of the victory. The Red Army's success was not only military, but psychological, restoring faith that the German war machine could be beaten. Posters went up across cities and villages, declaring Moscow's defense a symbol of Soviet strength. Prisoners of war were paraded as evidence that the enemy could bleed, and deep within Soviet lines, the victory lit a fire of determination that no winter storm could extinguish. On the global stage, the impact of Moscow was immediate and electrifying. In London, newspapers splashed headlines announcing that the Soviet Union had stood firm, shattering German hopes of a quick war in the East. Churchill hailed the victory, recognizing its importance for the survival of the Allied cause. In Washington, the battle bolstered arguments that aiding the Soviets was not futile but essential, strengthening calls for increased Lend-Lease support. Across occupied Europe, underground resistance groups found new hope in the news, distributing leaflets that proclaimed Germany's first great setback. Even in neutral countries, diplomats took note. The Reich was not infallible, and its future no longer seemed guaranteed. The winter outside Moscow changed the tone of war rooms across continents, shifting perceptions of balance. What had once been seen as an unstoppable conquest now appeared vulnerable to collapse, and this global shift in morale was as critical as the battle itself. For the German High Command, the battle's failure was more than a setback. It was a strategic wound that could never fully heal. The Wehrmacht had lost tens of thousands of men and vast amounts of equipment, much of it irretrievable in the Russian winter. Panzer units that had once been the cutting edge of blitzkrieg were reduced to skeleton formations, their tanks frozen, abandoned, or destroyed. Infantry divisions were stretched thin, holding lines with diminished strength and battered morale. Hitler's decision to demand no retreat, orders only deepened the crisis, condemning soldiers to unnecessary losses. Generals who had once basked in glory now endured the humiliation of retreat, their reputations tarnished. The dream of a swift and decisive victory had been shattered. And though the Wehrmacht would recover and fight fiercely in the months to come, the seeds of ultimate defeat had been planted. For Soviet commanders, the victory at Moscow validated months of preparation, sacrifice, and faith in their strategy. Zhukov and his staff demonstrated that defense in depth, combined with reserves strategically held back, could blunt and even break German armored thrusts. The arrival of Siberian divisions, clad in white camouflage and hardened by brutal winters, had tipped the balance at the crucial moment. For many Soviet soldiers, this was their first true taste of victory after months of devastating losses. It was not only a military achievement, but a restoration of confidence in their own ability to fight and win. Commanders across the Red Army studied the lessons of Moscow, laying the foundation for future counteroffensives. And in the Kremlin, Stalin savored the triumph, using it to bolster his legitimacy and galvanize his people. The city had been saved, and with it, the Soviet Union's will to fight. Beyond strategy, the battle also reshaped the psychological landscape of the war. For ordinary Germans, who had once believed in a swift victory, doubt crept in for the first time. For Soviet civilians, who had endured starvation, air raids, and the terror of occupation, hope returned in a flood. In Allied capitals, the news from Moscow reinforced the belief that Hitler could be stopped, that resistance was not futile, and across the world, the image of Nazi invincibility was permanently tarnished. The Reich was no longer a predator devouring Europe unchecked, but an empire that could be bloodied and turned back. This shift in perception was as powerful as any tank or rifle, for it altered how nations planned, fought, and dreamed of the war's end. And in that shift lay the first true glimmer of Allied victory. The Battle of Moscow did not end the war, but it ended an illusion. Hitler's armies, which had marched with unstoppable speed across half a continent, had been forced to halt and retreat. The Soviet Union, written off as weak and doomed, had proven its endurance and power. For the first time since 1939, the trajectory of the war bent away from the Reich's ambitions. The world saw that the Eastern Front would not be a quick campaign, but a brutal, grinding struggle. The victory inspired resistance, galvanized alliances, and changed the course of global strategy. And though millions more lives would be lost before the war's end, the tide had begun to turn. The snows of Moscow had written a new chapter in history, and with that chapter, the fate of the Reich was sealed, even if its final collapse still lay years ahead. The legacy of Operation Typhoon is written not only in military records, but in the very psyche of nations that endured its fury. To Germany, the failure before Moscow became a wound that never truly healed, a bitter reminder that their lightning war had limits. To the Soviet Union, it became a symbol of survival, proof that the Red Army could endure the storm and fight back even when the enemy stood at its gates. The battle was not just another entry in the Eastern Front. It was the moment when the tide of perception shifted. Soldiers who survived remembered the snow, the hunger, and the desperate nights where the fate of empires hung by a thread. Generals remembered the miscalculations, the lost opportunities, and the shattering of confidence in Hitler's infallibility. Civilians remembered digging trenches, shivering in unheated homes, and clinging to the hope that their city would stand. The clash became myth, a story told for decades as the moment Germany's dream of victory froze in the Russian winter. And from that point forward, every German soldier knew the war would not be won quickly. The battle became a graveyard of German hopes, not only in a military sense, but in a symbolic one. Hitler had promised his people that Moscow would fall, that the Soviet Union would crumble, and that the war in the East would be won by sheer force of will. Instead, his armies stood paralyzed in snowdrifts, bleeding men and machines as Soviet counterattacks rolled them back. The psychological impact was devastating. The aura of invincibility that had followed the Wehrmacht since 1939 was shattered. Even within German high command, whispers grew louder that the war could not be sustained on so many fronts. For the first time, questions of strategy were drowned out by questions of survival. The Reich had gambled everything on a single campaign, and Moscow had proven too great a prize. The graves outside the capital stood as silent monuments to hubris, and in every frozen trench, German soldiers knew the tide of fortune had shifted. For the Soviet Union, the victory became more than a military achievement. It was a source of national identity. Stalin used the defense of Moscow as proof of the resilience of socialism, praising the Red Army and the people for withstanding what had seemed an unstoppable enemy. Propaganda posters showed brave workers, soldiers, and peasants united in defense of the motherland, turning their struggle into legend. The parade in Red Square on November 7, 1941, where troops marched directly from Stalin's speech to the front lines, became an immortal image of defiance. The arrival of Siberian divisions, the counterattacks in December, and the survival of the capital itself became cornerstones of the Soviet wartime narrative. In homes across the Soviet Union, the story was retold as proof that no matter the hardship, the nation could endure. For the people, it was not just a victory, but a validation that their suffering had meaning, and it gave them strength for the brutal years of war still ahead. Globally, Operation Typhoon altered the perception of the conflict in a way that reverberated across continents. In Britain, the news was seized upon as a sign that the Soviets were not collapsing, that they were capable of holding the line against the German juggernaut. In the United States, it strengthened arguments for full support of Moscow through Lend-Lease, binding the Allies closer together. In occupied Europe, whispers spread in cafes and factories that Germans had been stopped. Resistance movements found new courage, seeing proof that the Reich could falter. For neutral nations, Moscow's survival was a sign that betting on German victory was no longer a certainty. And for the Axis partners, the reality was sobering. Germany was not invincible, and its war in the East would not be won quickly. The snow outside Moscow carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. It reshaped diplomacy, morale, and the course of the global war. For the German soldier who had marched so far, Moscow left scars that never faded. Veterans of the campaign recalled frost-bitten nights in makeshift shelters, comrades frozen to death beside them, and the endless sight of supply columns bogged down in snow. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, of longing for warmth, and of the crushing realization that the war would last far longer than they had been told. For many, the retreat from Moscow was their first taste of true defeat, a bitter contrast to the triumphs of Poland, France, and the Balkans. Even elite units, once the spearhead of Hitler's ambition, emerged battered and diminished. The winter campaign eroded not only strength but belief, draining away the sense of destiny that had carried them through earlier conquests. Moscow was more than a lost objective. It was the breaking of spirit, and in the years that followed, those memories haunted every new campaign. For Soviet civilians, Moscow became a story of collective endurance, passed down through generations as a moment of unity. Ordinary men and women had dug trenches, built barricades, and endured air raids while preparing to fight for every street. Children carried bricks and supplies, while elders stood in food lines, determined not to abandon their homes. When the front drew near, many families prepared for the worst, yet their city never fell. Afterward, the memory of those months became a point of pride, a narrative of shared sacrifice. For the survivors, every trench dug, every hour spent shivering in the cold, became part of the victory. And for the generations that followed, Moscow was remembered as the moment the Soviet people proved unbreakable. It was not merely a city defended, but a spirit immortalized, and that spirit carried them through the long war still to come. The strategic consequences of Operation Typhoon were profound. Germany had failed to capture Moscow, failed to knock the Soviet Union out of the war, and failed to prove that blitzkrieg could succeed on the scale of a continental empire. Instead, the Eastern Front became a war of attrition, stretching German resources beyond their limits. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, had proven its ability to mobilize, adapt, and strike back. The battle set the stage for Stalingrad, Kursk, and the great offensives that would eventually roll into Berlin. The idea of a quick war in the East was dead, buried beneath the snow and bodies outside Moscow. And with it, Hitler's grand strategy began to unravel. From this moment onward, Germany was not just fighting to win, it was fighting to survive. The failure of Typhoon was not a pause in the campaign. It was the beginning of the Reich's long decline. The legacy of Moscow endures as a turning point in the Second World War, remembered as the graveyard of German hopes and the birth of Soviet resilience. For historians, it is the moment when the tide shifted, when the myth of invincibility was broken and the war's balance began to tilt. For those who lived it, it was frost and fire, sacrifice and survival, despair and triumph, all at once. It was the city that refused to fall, the army that refused to die, and the people who refused to surrender. From the frozen forests of Kalinin to the burning villages of Bryansk, the echoes of Operation Typhoon resound in memory. The battle did not end the war, but it ended the illusion of certainty. And in that ending, it gave birth to the long and brutal road that would lead, eventually, to Berlin. Moscow was not just a city defended, it was the moment when history itself turned.